So, Dr. Hanna Rowlands, thank you for joining me for this interview today. Been looking forward to meeting you. I know I need to let you know we know each other personally. You were one of my PhD supervisors back in the day, and so I've been looking forward to this for personal reasons to meet you. You've been an inspiration to me. But thanks for being with us, and I'm going to call you Anna for the interview, if that's okay, Anna. Great.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me.
Oh, well, it's wonderful to have you. So, Anna, we'll go right back to the beginning, your ancestry. Now, I understand you had 3 grandparents from the west of Ireland who settled in the Manchester area. I think all good things come from Ireland. All my grandparents on both sides of my family are from Ireland and Northern Ireland. But tell me about your grandparents.
Well, so 2 of my grandparents were from the far west of Ireland, from Cavan and Sligo, my dad's mum and dad. And they were what would now be called horribly low-skilled economic migrants. I obviously do not think my grandparents were low-skilled at all, but I suppose in the lingo, that's what might be said now. My grandfather was from a huge family, sort of more than 10 siblings, and they were born in 2 batches. And he was from the second batch, and all but one left Ireland. So a really sort of standard tale of Irish migration, really, of huge, very impoverished families living on a very small amount of land. And the older siblings all went off to America. And then the younger batch came to the UK. And so my grandfather came, I think, when he was about 15. And he ended up sleeping homeless and was doing agricultural work. So he was an itinerant migrant, and then eventually ended up in Glasgow for a while, and ended up doing slightly more industrial work, and then settled in Manchester, which is where he met my grandmother, who'd come as a trained cook from Ireland to the Stockport area to be in service to a GP family. And it was kind of the very end of the time when Irish women would come to be in service to a family, and she ended up doing cotton factory work instead. And my grandfather drove a JCB and was an Irish navvy, and helped to lay the pipe work that brings water to Manchester from the Lake District. And yeah, basically that's what he did for his whole life. He was highly intelligent and very frustrated, I think, by that sort of lack of opportunity that he had back in Ireland. They attempted to persuade his parents. The local parish priest turned up to persuade his parents that he should be allowed to stay on at school beyond 13, but it just wasn't possible for financial reasons. And I think that that left a lifelong mark on him, really, to have a huge intelligence, really, and not be able to express that. And he was a very, very troubled man in lots of ways. He was an alcoholic, a functional alcoholic most of his life, right up until his death. And I suspect that the nature of exile, of losing your home, feeling that there was no place for you in that context, and a kind of deep frustration in himself at a sort of lack of fulfillment. I mean, I'm filling in the gaps rather than he never explained himself, as it were. But that left quite a mark on me. I never met my grandmother, my maternal grandmother from Cavan, because she died on the morning of my parents' wedding day. She had been diagnosed with leukemia, probably industrially related leukemia, and died only a week after the diagnosis, just a few hours before my parents were due to get married. So I grew up with her not really being talked about at all, because my dad found it incredibly traumatic to talk about her. So we grew up with this kind of shadow of grief, no photos of her anywhere. I think I was in my late teens by the time I first saw a photograph of her. So yeah, no, I mean, quite a sort of troubled Irishness in lots of ways. But yeah, definitely my roots are very west of Ireland. And on the other side, it's Kilkenny, so less west. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. During the interview, if I may just make a few little personal connections. So I grew up in this, I thought was a very small family from this Irish diaspora. You don't look into things much when you're a kid. And my paternal grandparents, I thought till recently I didn't have any other, aunts and uncles. Turns out I had 12 great aunts and uncles that I never knew, who all lived near me when I was growing up that I never met. And I just remember this sort of veil of secrecy when they moved down after the Second World War from Newcastle, were Catholics, but I never once saw them go to mass, never heard them talk about church, never talk about each other. It's just like they started this whole new life from this very intense mining background. That was my family. So they were all alcoholics to deal, I think, with the stress of that way of life.
Yeah.
So you don't come from academic stock.
Oh, absolutely not. None of my grandparents were able to finish school. My parents were really classic of that generation growing up, I guess, in the 50s, who were able to avail themselves of Catholic education at the hands of religious orders. And therefore, my mum went to a convent school. My dad went to a school called St. Bede's in Manchester, which is now an independent school, but wasn't then. And they were given really an extraordinary education, and that was their social mobility. And I think we forget that for so many of that age group, their social mobility, particularly in the Catholic community, came from an absolute dedication to schooling and a very, very high quality of education. And my dad basically ended up training as a classicist, thanks to the school that he was able to go to. He wanted to stay on at school because he was phenomenal. Well, he's still alive, phenomenally bright. And he really wanted that opportunity that his parents hadn't had. But in those days, he had to stay on an extra year at school in sixth form to do the Oxford entrance exams because he wanted to do classics at Oxford. And it wasn't possible for him to remain at home for another year and take those exams. So he went to Manchester instead. And did brilliantly well, etc. And that's where he met my mum. So they both stayed in their home city to go to university, were the first to be university educated in their families, and then both of them became teachers off the back of that. My dad, an absolutely passionate advocate of comprehensive school education, where he ended up as a head teacher in a pretty tough school that he turned around. And I think that upbringing plus the social mobility and their understanding that really that social mobility it's a troubled phrase, social mobility, and I do have a critique of that myself now, but nonetheless the social mobility of my parents' generation was absolutely at the hands of a determined approach to comprehensive, in the true sense of it, education.
Yeah, I know I'm a little older than you. But again, that story of social mobility, and I'll unpack it a little bit with you, how important that is. So my parents finished school without anything but Aspire, but there was a strong work ethic and aspiration through social mobility into education, which changed my life. We'll unpack that a little bit as we go forward, because it's important, not just for you personally, but some of the work that you're doing and things that you're writing about now. If I could just dwell with your grandparents a little bit, I understand you had an English grandfather that became a Catholic, converted to Catholicism. Is that right?
Yes, I had one English grandparent, one fully English grandparent, my grandfather, and on my maternal side, and he was a kind of sort of engineer, not a university trained engineer, but he had some engineering training and he worked in that area, and he converted when he married my grandmother. I suspect that it was simply a sort of a done deal, and a requirement, but actually he was more seriously, he was a very, very devout Catholic his whole life after meeting her. And I had no idea that he was a convert until I was told when I was a little bit older. And he was a very kind of quiet figure. My grandmother was the dominating personality. The women in my family are generally fairly dominating personalities on both sides in one way or another. So really she set the tone of things. But yes, I did have one English grandfather.
One of the things I do remember from my family was the presence of alcohol. And then as I've got to know the rest of my family, alcohol and Catholics seem to go together. Irish Catholics.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? My grandfather, absolutely, my paternal grandfather was an alcoholic, and it scarred his whole, his whole life, and it affected the family hugely, I think. And I think my sense is that often there's two reactions, one of which is to become in the next generation to become incredibly cautious around alcohol and really to feel the damage of that. The other is to replicate the behaviour. Or the problem. And fortunately, my father could see the damage that had done, and it didn't really transfer generationally. But my early memories were of the shame that my grandfather clearly felt, because he would go through phases of drinking very intensely, and his whole life would fall apart as drink took over. So the house would be filthy dirty, and the garden would be overgrown, and he would be incredibly morose. And I just remember that shame. And there's one particular occasion that I remember going round to the house. I must have been probably 10, 11 years old. And if you remember when we were at school, I don't think the age gap between us is that great that this won't be a shared experience. You had those photographs that were taken once a year in school, and then all your family, it's like a racket really, wasn't it? All your family purchased them for Christmas presents.
You had to get your family to buy them all, yeah.
Absolutely. And so each of my aunties, there were 5 children. My grandfather had 5 children, so each of them had then had children. So the photographs were all displayed on the top of a cabinet in his lounge. And I remember arriving for a visit and seeing that he'd turned all of our photographs face down. And to start with, I thought, that he decided he didn't like us all, or he was angry with us. And it took me a little while of just sitting there quietly to think, he doesn't want us to look at him. He can't bear to see our faces. And that, was in a phase when he'd gone back very heavily into drinking. And I think that sense of shame that often comes with alcoholism, and that sense of kind of distancing and isolation. And I think he suffered deeply from those feelings of shame, I think. And again, none of this was ever verbalised. It was simply what I sort of absorbed and assumed from...
So how old were you at that point, Anna, when you were making those observations?
I was probably about sort of 10 or 11. And I think my first inklings towards a kind of philosophical view of the world came from not entirely being able to reconcile or make sense of what I felt was the tragedy of his position. That I could see the gap and the distance between my father and my grandfather. And it was always cordial, and it's not that there was ever any conflict of any kind. There wasn't, but I could feel this communicative gap between my dad and his father of all the things that clearly could not be said. And years later, in fact, relatively recently, I remember my dad saying to me that really that breach came pretty early when he was able to study Latin and Greek, to have a kind of knowledge of the world that my grandfather didn't have. And I suspect, my grandfather wasn't entirely literate, I don't think. And I think that gap of being overtaken by your own son, I think probably there was a sense of slight humiliation in that. And I think that caused a distancing between them that I suspect was simply permanently unspoken. That became real. And I know from talking to other people in similar circumstances that they also have had that experience of that sort of gap, particularly between father and son, that comes about in those kind of contexts where your life experience suddenly becomes very different, and where you are evidently sort of moving your class identity and basis. And I think those transitions are really hard. And I remember just sort of watching all of that silently and thinking, how do you make sense of those conflicts, and how do you reconcile yourself to a sort of breach in relationship, which is nothing to do with having an argument or falling out, but is simply about the kind of tragedy of being caught up in the world as it is and the human condition as it is. And I think my first philosophical instincts really came from trying to make sense of that kind of complex relationship that I could see in front of me and where nobody put words around it, but I had to somehow configure it in my mind.
Yeah, well, you say you were trying to make sense, so that's 10, which is early on. Was anyone helping you with that? Were you reading things at that time, at that young age, or?
I have always read. I suspect I read more novels at that age, and so I've always had an attraction to the idea that literature helps us deal with the tragic, often more so than philosophy. So the place that is wordless, I think, is often interpreted in literature and in fiction and in poetry. So I suspect that it was a literary world that helped me make sense of it, as well as a liturgical one. So the words of the liturgy that help you deal with breaches and gaps, with that which cannot be mended, with an agency that isn't just yours. So I suspect, strangely, a combination of literature and liturgy were the spaces that gave me an opportunity to make some sense of that. And I didn't really read anything more philosophical or political till I was probably in my mid-teens. So that was a sort of later, development. And literature and philosophy at that point always belonged together for me when that did eventually emerge. So I wrote my GCSE stuff on Mary Barton and Manchester, Elizabeth Gaskell's novel. So I became very interested in the idea that literature and sort of journalistic writing were the two things that enabled you to make sense of the human condition. So I've been reading Elizabeth Gaskell's novel Mary Barton, which is set around the Northwest. and George Orwell. So I became an absolute devotee of Orwell from about 15 onwards. And just, you know, that sense of his writing out of the complexity of class relationships and identities, and travelling in order to sort of do that. So, you know, all of that became really important to me. And I didn't really start reading more theological work properly until I was really sort of 17 or so. And when I did, it was actually mysticism. So Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle. I remember asking for that for my 17th birthday from my auntie, who thought I'd lost my mind and thought I should want something more normal for my birthday.
Not average 17-year-old reading.
If you really want this, I will buy it for you, but...
Let me ask you, other than reminiscing and going strange thing for a 17-year-old to ask for, do you remember the 17-year-old you, why you wanted that book? Had you seen it? Had you already read it? Were you, you know, what was going on in you to make you want to read that kind of thing at 17?
I had an RE teacher who, I didn't do theology A-level, I didn't do religious studies A-level, but we had to have compulsory extra RE sessions even at sixth form college, because I went to a Catholic sixth form. And the woman who taught us there, whose name I can't even remember now, embarrassingly, had talked about Teresa of Avila. And I was very drawn to feminism, and I suppose I was struggling to put together the two bits of my existence, which was an interest in politics, you know, a growing commitment towards feminism, but also a sense of women in key intellectual and leadership roles in the church. And I suppose hearing a bit about the biography of Teresa of Avila drew me in. And I have always had an instinct towards contemplation. And I suppose that's what kept me going to Mass as a teenager, was really that it was the only space where that more kind of contemplative side of myself could grow. And so Teresa struck me as both this incredible leader. So she's leading a monastic community, she's developing a way of life, she's writing about the nature of God, but she's also writing out of a set of contemplative and mystical experiences. And all of those things drew me to her at 17. And I had just decided to apply to Cambridge, and I was applying to the first women's college. And so that heritage of trying to find a path through life that felt to me that, you know, there was a space for women to be fully themselves. And I needed to find that in ecclesial terms, as well as finding it in educational and political and personal terms.
And who was helping you navigate that path? Did you have friends at sixth form? Were your parents engaged with you, with your intellectual and philosophical questions? I mean, it sounds like they were, you know, making space for you to move into education in the way that you did. Well, who was around you, or were you finding this path on your own?
Yeah, there wasn't anybody, and I think actually often that's the experience that I've had. I mean, that, you know, I would love to say that I had a really inspirational teacher at school who stood out, or, you know, there was some truly remarkable person. You know, that there wasn't. And I think that, you know, I was in a state comprehensive in Stockport, and, you know, I had fairly normal teenage interests in, you know, music and clubbing and going out and socializing. And so I rather kept this intellectual side of myself to myself, because I didn't particularly want to stand out. So I would take myself off on the 192 bus that went from Stockport to Manchester Central Library, which I just think is one of the most glorious buildings in the country. And I would sit under the great dome of the reading room with, you know, Orwell and Teresa of Avila and, you know, Marx and Engels. And I would sit and I would just read, and I would go alone. I wouldn't tell anybody else that I was going, and I would get the bus back home, and then I would re-engage with the rest of a more normal teenage world, you know, down the pub on a Saturday night. But really that space of the library was kind of, you know, the space where my imagination was opened up. But it was almost entirely a solitary journey. I didn't have friends at school who had similar intellectual interests. I didn't really have guiding teachers. I had some nice teachers, but I didn't really have anybody who was a kind of intellectual steer in that way. I had people I admired in my family, but I admired them for their human qualities, you know, my dad and my auntie in particular, but they were more personal inspiration in terms of their integrity. But the intellectual journey was made, I have to say, until university, entirely alone and with some secrecy. I
never knew that about you, Anna. I know we've talked in the past, I used to get the 38 bus into Luton Town to the library. It seemed to be enormous, and I managed to get an adult reading pass as a teenager, and I go down on my own, wander around, pull books off every section, bring them home. I remember, I mean, this is a class thing. I remember my mother aspired to education for me, but the antipathy of the moment I walked through the door with 20 books in my arms, and she said, "Who do you think you are?" Well, she said some words I can't say. Sorry, I could just picture you off to the, so the 19, does the 192 bus still go?
Well, it does. Who's the comedian on Radio 4 that goes around different towns? I'm trying to remember his name.
Dave Gorman. Is it Dave Gorman? Or
no. Anyway, there's a Radio 4 comedian who goes round and he does
I know
in different towns, and he went to Stockport. And a whole bit of that broadcast was about the 192 bus, and he went round on the 192 bus, and I just died of happiness, pride and nostalgia as it described life on the top of the 192 bus. So no, I mean, my dad was very encouraging of reading, and my dad is an absolute worm and reads hugely, but his interests are in history, classics, he has about 5 languages, and he's an extraordinary mind, but I had very different interests intellectually to his. He viewed my interest in all things contemporary with a degree of sort of, amusement and derision, I think. When was I going to do a proper subject that involved, sort of texts and languages and things? So I think that I perfectly well had warmth and encouragement, but I didn't really have that mentoring space. Interestingly, in terms of what you just said about getting a library pass, I remember having a conversation a couple of years ago with both my parents and saying to them, when did you feel was the moment when you left, did you feel you left behind your working class roots? You'd entered this different world, and how did you relate to the working class origins of your family, particularly my dad? And my dad said, I don't know really. And my mum sort of said to him, I think it was the moment when you got a pass for the public library. And my dad sort of looked at her and said, well, maybe so, because we were talking about, is it the moment when you own property for the first time? So is it property ownership that distinguishes that? And in the end, my dad sort of said, no, it probably was the moment when I got this library pass and I realised that there was this whole world out there, and I just started to read my way into it. And that was both an opening up of the world, but also a closing down of sets of relationships as he expanded into that world, I suspect. So it's that kind of bittersweet moment of what a library represents. Interestingly, I mean, completely different twist, but I was doing some research with the Jesuit Refugee Service and interviewing de facto refugees living in asylum destitution in London, in the East End of London, last year. And really interesting to, incredibly difficult to hear, but really interesting to hear those who I was interviewing talking about the role of public libraries for those seeking asylum now, that they become spaces of both hospitality, but also privacy. And I was just so moved to hear them say, well, the only time when I feel I have a space that's private, because many of the people I was interviewing sleep on night buses or sofa surfing, or they're kind of hosted briefly by a household. But just that made me think again about just how significant public life. But yeah, that kind of struck me as an interesting coming full circle on my own experiences of libraries.
And Anna, just a bit more on your parents. So they were both teachers, I understand.
Yeah.
And when I say practicing Catholics, engaged in Catholic social teaching dynamics. Were they active with the Labour Party? So they were, there was an element to faith and practice for them as well as their education. What impact did that have on you that you can remember?
I think I was simply raised with a sense that your Catholicism was not something that you practiced for an hour a week at Mass. It was a kind of whole life venture. I did not grow up in a very pious family. By that I mean there wasn't sort of grace before meals, there wasn't a sort of great intensity around conversations. And I think actually both of my parents have been very troubled by the church institutional. So I grew up with this sense of a kind of quiet critique of the church and a sort of troubledness at some of the practices. And this was long before the child abuse allegations. And I mean, I was actually baptised by a priest who was then convicted of paedophilia long before the rest of the scandals had come out. And so my parents were very aware that they had put me baptismally into the hands of a paedophile priest. And they were very troubled and disturbed by that. But nonetheless, their Catholicism is just very deeply rooted and very profound, I think, and quiet. So my parents are both, deeply prayerful and deeply thoughtful, but with a huge commitment to social justice. My dad was a member of the Labour Party for many years, and at one point, I think before I was born or when I was very young, he stood as a councillor. And I think that their commitment to education was the primary expression of that social justice vision. My dad in retirement, well, both my parents actually helped run 2 food banks, various different points, and my dad we trained on retirement as a Citizens Advice Bureau advisor, which he still does now. So their commitment to really, I think, just human dignity and a sense that, we exist in networks of solidarity. And without ever using that language kind of preferential option for the poor. It was not something that was theorised, it was simply sort of woven into the warp and weft of everyday lives and the kind of commitments that they had. So it was never verbalised, it was never showy, but it was just a kind of quiet determination to see the world a particular way.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like that was integrated into your life from an early age for yourself. So for you to be a practicing Catholic and know that faith and practice go together and be engaged in the political world and public world was just normal for you.
Yes, and it was, I think, the first point at which I ever thought that anybody else saw it any other way was when I first got to university. And I think when you grow up in an immigrant sort of diaspora culture, which I did, my exposure until I was 18 was basically simply to a largely Irish, sometimes Italian, sometimes Polish, etc. Catholic world, in which people thought in broadly the same ways. I mean, they had different political views. There were disagreements, of course, but I did grow up in a thought world, and a life world is probably a better way of putting it, because it wasn't a heady world at all. A life world in which faith, action, politics all belonged together, and there was no separation. I grew up without a sort of sense of literal separation of these things, really. And at 18, it was a shock to discover that the rest of the world really didn't think that these things belonged together, either practically or intellectually.
Yeah. I'm going to get to university in a moment and the transition from school to university, but we need to highlight your particular claim to fame. That when you were much younger, you appeared on Top of the Pops singing "There's No One Quite Like Grandma." Now, I've been onto YouTube and I found the video of that, and I found one that's been viewed nearly 150,000 times, and I spent far too long going through it trying to see if I could see which one was you.
No, well, so this is the story that needs to be told. So I went to St Winifred's in Stockport as a primary school, and we had a choir mistress, Miss Foley, who was absolutely determined that our choir would be famous. Well, I'm not very good at singing. It's the one gift I wish I had. I would trade anything for the ability to sing in tune. I adore singing, even though I can't sing very well. So every year I would turn up and audition for this damn school choir. And every year I would be turned away until eventually I wore her down. And I think she just couldn't face looking at me with this sad, disappointed face anymore. And so she let me in. Now, so there were a group of slightly older children, pupils from the school, who sang Grandma We Love You on Top of the Pops. In fact, I was on Top of the Pops, but it was after that had been recorded. So it was a couple of years after, and we sang with the Nolan sisters. And to my great amusement, we were supposed to sing, it was the Christmas special, and I'm just underneath the Christmas tree on that one. And we were supposed to sing with Shakin' Stevens, but at the last minute, Shakin' Stevens thought we might damage his reputation if he was seen with us. So therefore, we ended up stuck with the Nolan sisters instead. So I was on Top of the Pops, and it was my school that sang that song. But in fact, the actual edition of Top of the Pops that has Grandma We Love You, I'm not on that one. I'm on a couple of years later on Top of the Pops.
I shall waste some time on YouTube and find under the Christmas
tree. Under the Christmas tree.
Maybe if we can find the link, we'll put it in the, as I say, the show notes for people.
I tell my students each year, I do an icebreaker where I say to them in the first session, why did you choose this course? And each person has to go around the room and say something about themselves that is an unlikely fact that you wouldn't guess from just, you know, generally knowing that person. The most amazing things come up. And I always start off by saying, well, the thing that you won't automatically know about me is I was on top of the pops. And I don't say anything else. And they kind of look at you and think, gosh, you know, was she famous in some earlier part of her existence? And then eventually I fess up that in fact it was my primary school, wearing some terrible pink gingham dress. Anyway, yeah.
So I sense some, with your auditioning, persistence with what you wanted to pursue in life. So let me ask you about going off to Cambridge. So you go from a comprehensive school in Stockport off to Cambridge. What was, I mean, I know you're encouraged into education, you were pursuing that, but you've already talked about a little bit of some of the shocks that awaited you. I understand that arriving at Cambridge wasn't easy for you in your first term. So tell us a bit about that, moving from Stockport to Cambridge.
I think the interesting thing when I look back at it now myself as an adult is to realise that I absolutely did not want to go to Cambridge. My teachers at sixth form, we had a system where teachers would recommend the pupils who they thought stood a chance of getting into Oxbridge. And to my absolute surprise, I'd never thought of myself as being particularly bright. I mean, I did win subject prizes and I'd got a very good set of results, but for whatever reason, I didn't think of myself as being somehow stupendously intelligent. And so I had assumed that people who went to Oxbridge were just this sort of, you know, cadre of people that I would never be, you know, sort of even anywhere near. So my subject teachers recommended me for English and politics for Oxbridge. And so I had a conversation with my teachers who said, you know, we really would like to encourage you to apply. And I had just thought to myself that it was a world that I would feel perhaps uncomfortable in. And the idea had never crossed my mind. Now, because I'm a slightly perverse character, you're right to pick up on that. In fact, my history teacher, who at the time I wasn't particularly fond of, she called me to one side and said, you know, look, Hannah, I know that the others have recommended you for Oxbridge, but just a bit of advice. I think you're a little too ordinary for Oxbridge. And she said, you know, I'm not saying that you're not very bright, but you need to be a bit eccentric to fit in there. And I think you're just a bit too ordinary. And I just sort of looked at her and I was so horrified that in that moment, I went from complete diffidence about applying to thinking, well, I'll bloody well get in now you've said that. How dare you? So it kind of developed a determination that I should at least get a place and then turn it down. So I tricked my mind into imagining that I would see if I could get this place and then I would turn it down because really it wasn't my world. And I got carried along by the enthusiasm of my teachers. And I never really made the choice freely for myself. And I think that's what went wrong in the first term, because I couldn't own it as a choice, partly because it meant moving away from all my friends who were going to universities in the north. I was the only person at that point in my friendship group who was, I mean, many of my friends were not going to university at all. But those of us who were, they were all going to universities in the north. And those friendships were really important to me. And I didn't know anybody who'd left the north of England. And it felt like a really high risk thing to do. So when I arrived at Cambridge, having not really ever quite made that choice, because I thought, well, either I won't get in or I'll turn it down when I do. And then I suddenly found myself there. And I found the culture shock enormous. I did not belong to a world of high table and knowing which way to pass the port. And knowing how to make the kind of small talk that I felt was necessary to survive in that world. And although I could feel myself thriving intellectually, because finally I didn't have to be secretive about having intellectual interest, I didn't have to slope off to a library by myself on the bus and not tell anybody else where I was going. So I had this odd experience of suddenly coming alive intellectually and feeling myself fully stimulated by that learning environment, but feeling socially and culturally completely out of my depth. So I attempted to leave after my first term and I applied for a transfer to Sheffield University, who offered me a place mid-year with great enthusiasm. And I went home to tell my parents that I was changing university. And the only time I've ever fallen out with my parents, they basically were absolutely distraught and thought I was making a terrible decision, and basically told me that they would sort of, you know, be deeply disappointed and cross with me if I made this move, and sent me back. My memory is that they told me that they would cut my funding off. This may, in fact, I don't know whether it's true or not. My dad says it's the one thing that he regrets. about the way that they sort of handled me at that point, because I did feel incredibly isolated. So I got back on the train to Cambridge knowing that I couldn't choose Sheffield because I couldn't make it work, and that I was causing great distress to my parents, who felt I had a chance in life that they hadn't had, and that I was foolishly squandering it. And I got back on the train, and at that point I thought, well, I have to make it work now. So it became almost a sort of determination in the face of adversity, pathetically. And that's somehow psychologically how I turned the corner, because I realised that I had no option. It wasn't a question of choosing it and now had to make it work. And in fact, from very quickly after that, I then thrived. And I have to say, I adored the experience and got huge amounts from it. But that first term was just huge culture shock.
So going back, owning your own place there, thriving. Well, tell us a little bit more what that looked like. What did it look like for you to come alive and thrive in that environment? What do you try? I
think there are two things about the Cambridge system that for me work, and there's a huge critique that can be made about institutional privilege and all of the problems of Oxbridge. So it's not to ignore those, but just to speak personally. The experience of coming from an Irish culture that was very oral, or at least a background in a sort of surrounding Irish culture that was very oral, actually lent very well to a Cambridge supervision system in which you were expected to defend constantly, to be articulate, to articulate. And it gave me an opportunity to learn in a style, a dialogical style, that suited me down to the ground. And so I actually just thrived in a very small group environment where you were forced to defend your position, to articulate your position, to develop it under pressure, to have all of that challenged and stripped back. And I actually rather thrived in that more adversarial culture, because it didn't feel a million miles away, oddly, from the culture I'd come from. So I could recognise and make that connection. So that worked for me. The other side of it that worked for me, people who go to Oxbridge often, it sounds a bit pretentious, describe reading for a degree rather than studying for a degree. And I read for a degree. And it gave me the opportunity to simply read whatever I wanted to read. And I had huge amounts of time to just devour whatever I wanted to. And that meant that because my interests had this oddly wide range, I could simply read independently and make those connections. So it freed my mind intellectually, and it focused on being led by reading. And I think that was significant because I had never really had mentor figures. So my mentoring came in the form of authors, of texts. And I felt that was where I was having my thought, sort of expanded. So the mentoring was really through reading and through relationships with my peers. And I had 2 or 3 friends in particular who were PhD students when I was an undergraduate. And those intellectual relationships with, they were slightly, they were peers, but they were at a slightly higher level. Those were absolutely critical for me. And it's embarrassing to say, and I wish it wasn't true, but I got through to the end of my undergraduate degree, and really the most significant relationships I had in terms of intellectual formation were either with peers or simply what I encountered through reading.
Well, yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. Was there any particular tutor? But there seems to be a common theme that even at this point, there's no particular mentor other than from literature again. So Teresa of Avila spurs you on, and and I'm going to ask you in a bit about, I do know a bit about, once we get to your PhD, some of the influences in your life there. Let me ask you, Anna, so, and again, I'm asking this question knowing from bits I've listened to you online and read. You talked about the challenge of that dialogical process that you're in, and sounds like the cut and thrust of what you believe and don't believe. And you were doing political science, weren't you? Was that what you were doing?
Yeah, so I did. It's the Cambridge equivalent of PPE, and it was called, so in those days it was called social and political sciences. It was previously, it used to be called moral sciences, and then they updated it and called it social and political sciences, and it's now got a very slightly different name. Basically, it's a combination of anthropology, sociology, psychology and politics, political theory and political science, and I ended up focusing mainly on social theory and political science. So really my degree really is in a little bit of anthropology and quite a lot of social theory.
And any presentation of again, I'm a little older than you, but anticipating that secularization theory was quite prevalent then. And any pushback on you with your Catholicism?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing is we had to do empirical studies as part of our degree. So we had to do research methods, and we were expected to do a project in our second year. And then I did a dissertation that was empirical in my third year, and I wanted to study contemporary women religious from an anthropological ethnographic point of view. So I wanted to do an ethnography basically on radical religious sisters who lived out Catholic social teaching, although I didn't, quite configured it in that language then, but that's what I wanted to do. And there was just head scratching as to why on earth I would want to do this, because proper anthropology was done abroad, not in the UK. And, studying a religious community seemed a very sort of small scale way of doing things. And in the end, I was sent to the Dean of Jesus College, who was an anthropologist, Tim Jenkins, because they just couldn't find anybody to supervise me. So there was just this kind of sense of bewilderment as to why, if you were reasonably clever, you wanted to work on ethnographic studies of UK-based religious communities for a dissertation. That seemed a very peculiar thing to want to do. Nobody really got why I wanted to do it. So there was a kind of practical suspicion there. People kept saying to me, but this just isn't very, it's sort of not very intellectually stimulating. The other side of it was I became increasingly alienated from the kind of sociological work that so wanted to just see religion in phenomenal terms, and just really couldn't see it as a kind of live tradition with a long, sort of history of ideas tradition that could be tarried with as something useful in a live and contemporary sense. And I remember endlessly being taught stuff that was all about, secularization as the present and the future. And the point of contradiction to that, which then became a doorway into a much bigger world, was being taught the Frankfurt School in my third year. And I was taught by an academic at King's who was brilliant. And, he opened the world to Adorno and Horkheimer and Walter Benjamin.
I was about to say, I can start to see the questions that I've got coming up for you, where the streams start to flow in. Great.
But, I mean, what I still find troubling and fascinating about that experience now is that it took an entry through Jewish social philosophy to legitimate a pathway back into Christian social philosophy. So it was realizing that you couldn't understand Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin, etc., without some sense of the Jewish hinterland that suffused their work, and that they were able to move deftly between these different thought worlds. And a literacy across traditions was vital to developing a critical view of the world, a critical constructive social theory. And I had wanted desperately to bring the bits of the Catholic intellectual tradition that I knew of into dialogue with the really interesting social and political theory that I felt I was learning, and nobody was interested in that. Nobody thought it was particularly worthwhile. And somehow the Frankfurt School legitimated for me that pathway. And just as I had finished reading Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin, etc., John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory had been published. And so suddenly that made sense to me. His critique made sense to me. John's work is vitally important to my intellectual development. I don't sort of badge myself as radical orthodoxy, in a kind of direct sense, but it was permission giving, and it gave me a language. And I know we'll talk about Gillian Rose afterwards, but the pathway for me was really, you couldn't support, in my view, secularization theory of the world, not just in terms of the evidence that religion was so significant globally, just at a sort of experiential, evidential level, but also that intellectually, you just cut yourself off from such deep and fruitful roots if you refuse to work with, to labour with that intellectual tradition. And the combination of the Frankfurt School and then into Milbank and Gillian Rose, that was the sort of gateway for me into a more expansive world.
So it sounds like, you were struggling to find someone to supervise your interests and those explorations, and the university unable to do that. But by the time you've got a very interesting CV, actually. So before we get to your PhD, can we fill in some of those gaps? Well, not gaps, just the different things that you did over that time. So you finish at Cambridge.
Yeah.
And what do you do when you finish at Cambridge?
Well, I'd figured out by the time I'd read the Frankfurt School Millbank and I started to read Gillian Rose in my final year, I figured out that really what I needed to do was a theology degree. And it wasn't that I wanted to leave behind the social and political science stuff, but I felt that the questions that really I had thought were sociological questions were all in the end theological. And indeed, the roots of modern debates on sociological and political theory questions were theological anyway. So I thought, okay, I need to kind of read and think in this area. So I wanted to do an MA, but I only had a first degree in political science, social and political science. So I knew I wouldn't be able to get onto a theology MA. And I also had no money, no way of funding that. You couldn't get loans in those days for MAs. So I thought to myself, right, how do I get myself on an MA? So anyway, I went to Heathrow and talked my way into a place at Heathrow with the Jesuits. And I told them, I convinced them that I had all of this kind of sort of religious social theory. So I've been reading lots of Lisa Rougaret and Julia Kristeva and the kind of radical French feminists. So I sold myself to them on the basis of the kind of religion.
You bust your way with previous.
My way with radical French feminism and the Frankfurt School.
The Frankfurt
School. But I had to fund it. And so a religious community, they were then the IBVM sisters, who now were the CJ sisters. They had a house in Kentish Town and they offered me accommodation. And I got myself a job teaching 30 hours a week in a crammer sixth form college in order to fund the MA. So I taught very bright students who had failed their A-levels first time round. I taught by day and then I did the MA by night and just read my way through the MA and completed that in 2 years. And then at that point I could come to a crossroads, and whenever I've come to a crossroads, I always apply for 3 completely different things. So I applied for fast stream civil service. I applied for a job as a chaplain in a special needs school because the MA was in pastoral theology, because that was the only degree they could have it into without a prior degree in theology. And I also applied for a DPhil in Oxford. And I got offered the DPhil place in Oxford, but they insisted I had to do a proper MST year to take it up, and I had no way of funding it. So it was like offering me something I couldn't take. And so that's what I wanted to do really, was the DPhil, but I knew that I couldn't access it because I didn't have the funds to do a further MA year full-time and be resident in Oxford. And fast stream civil service seemed really interesting to me until I had the psychologist interview. So I passed the exam, went to the interview, and the psychologist we had a very interesting intellectual discussion about sort of leadership and the nature of listening and human relationships. And at the end, he said to me, "I don't think you really want to do this, do you?" And I thought, no. So that was the end of the fast stream civil service. And so then I got offered the job as a special needs chaplain in a school for children with moderate learning difficulties. So mainly the pupils in the school had Asperger's syndrome, Tourette's, and a range of other learning special needs. And so I worked as the director of pastoral studies and the chaplain there, and sort of regrouped and worked out what I wanted to do. And then for personal reasons, I ended up needing to move to North Wales. And at that point then had my son, who's now 19. And so I decided that on the basis that I was then doing another school chaplaincy job, I'd moved from one chaplaincy job to another. I wasn't earning enough to be able to pay for childcare and go to work. So I thought, well, it's time to do the PhD then. And because I was living in North Wales, I was then able to do the PhD at Manchester. And at that point, Manchester was a really exciting department. It had Graham Ward, Grace Jansen, Elaine Graham, who supervised me. And there was a real culture of wanting to engage with both empirical work, with social theory, with mysticism. And so it kind of brought together my intellectual interest with a really interesting group of people, and I felt very at home in Manchester at that point. It felt like an exciting place to be. So with a very small baby and no childcare, I started, well, he was weeks old when I started, I undertook childcare and a PhD until eventually I got a job halfway through the PhD. I got offered a job in Cambridge at Westcott House as the director of pastoral care there, and so pastoral studies rather there. So I moved to teach political theology and pastoral studies in an Anglican formation training setting, and then finished the PhD 2 years into that.
Gosh, so 10 years of your life, that was a whistle-stop tour of 10 years there from when you started the MA through to the PhD. And it'd be easy to skate over the MA And I'm wondering if there's another ongoing pattern here with this question I'm going to ask. Were there any tutors that stood out to you? I mean, was it just getting a theological qualification that you needed? Or was there something intrinsic to the course and the people teaching it that inspired you? And how much were you still doing your own reading?
Well,
and plowing your own furrow?
I mean, there may have been people who, if I had had the time, could have been deeply inspirational. But the reality was that I was working 30 hours a week. It was my first teaching job. So I was preparing all of this A-level teaching and trying to do a master's at the same time. And so I had very little time to be in college. I did not have a sort of postgraduate experience of hanging out and going to seminars and being able to spend lots of time. It was really to have the reading lists, to attend the compulsory seminars that I needed to attend, and just to read and to write and to get a theological qualification that would then enable me to do the PhD. And I knew that I wanted to work on Gillian Rose from my final year as an undergraduate. It was just an obsession that didn't go away. So I knew that the MA was my pathway to being able to do further study as much as anything else. And so no, I'm afraid again, I just read fairly independent. I mean, I feel almost embarrassed saying this, but you know, I just sort of read independently. But I mean, there were lovely people at Heathrow, and you know, I wouldn't, you know, I'm sure if I'd had more time, perhaps there would have been individuals who would have been really important to me.
So what were you reading independently at that time that you can remember that inspired you, that may have been more strange presents to ask relatives to buy you?
Well, I sort of developed this interest in phenomenology and the way in which phenomenologists were always on the edge of theology. And so I've been reading Husserl, and then that led me to Edith Stein. So I was reading a strange combination of Husserl, Edith Stein. Again, I did a kind of spirituality course, so I was reading John of the Cross, and you know, so I was reading across those kind of areas, as well as trying to keep up with my sort of radical feminist and Gillian Rose reading. So I had these kind of, you know, these kind of very different areas that I was trying to sort of map over. But I began to develop this sense that there were a group of women who were deeply attracted to philosophy, had a Jewish background, had a strong engagement with even a conversion into Christianity, and that they kept the robustness of that metaphysical, philosophical world alive alongside an active interest in contemplation and in the sort of, you know, big questions of, you know, of social critique. And so I just developed a set of felt instincts by reading around that, you know, why was it that nobody saw that these women, Simone Weil, Gillian Rose, Edith Stein, Hanna Arendt, why was it that nobody saw these women as a canon of a kind? And I think I was just beginning to develop during my MA a felt sense that there was some kind of threads, some sinews of connection between these women and what they were trying to do, and that it was not entirely different, sorry, that would be a misleading comment. It was a distinctive set of intellectual concerns woven together, different answers. It's not that there was any kind of agreement between them, but there was something in the nature of their questions and the places they went to resource those questions that made me feel that they belonged together in a way that wasn't recognised, and that they were doing something intellectually different related to these big thought movements of 20th century philosophy and theology, that they were doing something improvised in their own way that wasn't really being recognised. And I wasn't sure enough in my own judgment, confident enough in my own intellectual instincts to really say, okay, I think there's a canon here, and I think this is really interesting. And why is it that these women who sit both partly inside of but partly outside of these multiple traditions, but insist on holding them together, and their citizenship in each of these multiple communities of intellectual and practical belonging, why is it that they're not seen and read together, and that difference that they bring is not recognised? So I think I started to develop my instincts around some of that for my MA. So I did my MA dissertation on Edith Stein and phenomenology for my MA for that reason. So it is the piecing together of these women figures, and it wasn't a conscious thing, but I started to develop a sort of felt sense that there was a very interesting draw, and that they might belong together in some rather eclectic way.
Mm. And is that where, was it doing your MA that you discovered Gillian Rose, or had you already discovered her?
Well, actually, that's an interesting question. So when I was in my third year at university, I had a very close friend, Amanda Hatfield, as she then was. She became Amanda Perisocene and she was a legal scholar. She was doing a jurisprudence PhD in the law department. She was working on John Finnis as a natural law thinker, but from a legal point of view. And she had converted to Catholicism, and I knew her through the chaplaincy. And she was a very close friend of mine and a really important, one of the most important intellectual dialogue partners of my life. And she had been invited to a private reading of the letters that Simon Barrington Ward, who'd been the Bishop of Coventry, who had received Gillian Rose into the Church of England on her deathbed, had exchanged with Rose. So the first thing that I knew about Gillian Rose at all was that my friend Amanda had been to this rather bizarre Cambridge evening where she'd been invited sort of semi-secretly to this reading of these letters in the presence of Simon Barrington Ward in the chaplain's rooms at Corpus. And she'd been really profoundly moved by the letters being read. And she came to me the next day and she said to me, I went to this extraordinary event last night. I think I've found someone who you need to read. And she told me the story of the letters, and she told me a bit about Gillian Rose's biography. And she said, listening to the letters and the intellectual exchange between them made me think of the conversations that you and I have, and this yearning for social theory and theology to belong together. And I think this woman seems to be thinking in a way that sounds like you would find really helpful. So at that point, Love's work had just been published, but I hadn't read it. Love's work was the autobiography that Rose wrote just before she died. And so I went off and I read that, and it was just life-changing for me because it did give me precisely this language that crossed over between a sort of critical feminism, not a straightforward feminism at all, but a critical feminism, a very, very interesting sort of continental philosophy, and a yearning for theological questions, but also suffused with literature and an interest in just this whole huge, vast intellectual hinterland. And I just was, I mean, my mind was blown really by reading Rose, both in terms of a recognition and again, a permission giving, but also a really fundamental challenge that I simply didn't have the references at my fingertips to be able to fully understand what I was reading, and an absolute determination that I needed to enter that thought world and belong to it. So that was in my third year at university. So I wasn't ever taught Rose on a course. I was handed her work personally following her death by this friend who had encountered Simon Barrington Ward's personal commitment and relationship with Rose.
And again, it would be easy to skate over everything that you did until your PhD, because it seems inevitable that you'd end up there and doing what you do now. But being a chaplain involved with special needs, as a teacher, and then this pastoral side of you. So you become the director of pastoral studies, don't you, at Westcott House? There's that. If I can lean into my guest trying to find a question here for you, that pastoral side is obviously very meaningful to you, other than just to pay the bills while you could do your own reading before you got to do your DPhil. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should be very clear in saying that I had never intended to end up as an academic. I had no, and that's partly because I just didn't have a reference point for it. I mean, even bizarrely, having been to university, I still couldn't imagine that I would ever end up in the position of the people who taught me. So it just hadn't ever crossed my mind. And even registering for a PhD, it didn't cross my mind that I might end up as an academic, which I know that probably sounds bizarre, but it just didn't. I disassociated, I think, so far from that world. So there was still a question of what I would do. And my interest has always been in practices, both the understanding of them and the transformation of them, I suppose. And so I felt that it was all about staking yourself in the world. And one of the things that really inspired me reading Gillian Rose was not simply the more metaphysical side of her work, but her absolute commitment to practice, action, transformation. The same in Hanna Arendt, the same in Simone Weil. The end point of their thought is action in the world. It's getting, they would say, it's getting as deeply into the world as you can. And I suppose I assumed that being an academic was not a way to get very deeply into the world. And so my instincts were that I needed to be in some other kind of role, and that I was using the intellectual stuff to discover the world. And then eventually I would inhabit some kind of role that would be much more about sort of, in my mind, being with others in that space. And the pastoral side of me was vocational, I think. And the special needs work that I did was massively challenging, particularly working with children young people with Asperger's syndrome, I learned all sorts of things about what it means to be human via that pathway that have stayed with me for life. And it was an extraordinary experience for me. It was fairly brief, but you know, the lessons that I learned there about how to travel with people who really see the world and experience it in a very different way from the way I did. I learned that structure and discipline and routine were life-giving. And I just learned about the sort of multiple ways in which the world can be perceived, observed, translated, and dwelt within. So that became hugely important to me and has stayed with me, even though it's not work that I carried on doing.
I know outside of our interview, when we first met, we shared many conversations. My daughter with Asperger's and all of her related issues, and how helpful that your experience was for me with all I was facing back then. So thank you for that. So I'm it sounds like as I discover things in this interview with you, that you if I pull on some words that you used earlier, there was this possible canon of this group of women. There was this thread that you wanted to pull. So was your and you've been up to this point, as I say, doing your own reading and being inspired by the literature. Was your DPhil just sort of sounds like the culmination of not an inevitable academic career. You've already said that's what it wasn't, but it was just the sheer opportunity to put together your own reading in that environment vigorously and rigorously to try and discover something. Was it just for the sheer, sounds like the sheer joy of it and the possibility of it?
I think I would say it was the sheer necessity of it. And I think it was pursuing for me, I needed to find a framework that made sense of the world in some way and offered me a space to think from, to act from. And I hadn't got to the end of reading these sources that I found helpful. So the way to keep reading them legitimately and thinking with them as robustly as possible was to do a PhD. And I couldn't not do it. And I tried not to do it by going off and doing some other stuff and thinking, at one point I was going to apply for NHS management, schemes, and, I applied for a job in journalism, and, there were all sorts of things that I thought I might do. And the teenage me had really wanted to be a journalist or a politician. So even though both seemed so far outside my own world, so I still assumed I was working my way back round to something like that. And I think I needed to keep thinking with these sources in order to try to think the world, and to find my pathway through it. And it seemed that the practical pathway would come through thinking with these sources as robustly as I possibly could. So I think it was sheer necessity in a way that drove the PhD.
Wow. And I mean, in a little reading around for today, noting that so Gillian Rose was described as the patron saint of outsiders.
Who said that?
Andre, I can't pronounce this. Is it Gide? Gide? Describes her as the patron saint of outsiders. But I found an interview where Gillian Rose talked about her experience of philosophy. She seems as you seem like kindred spirits, not just intellectually, but she sounded remarkably unimpressed with some of her educational environment.
Well, she was trained in Oxford rather than in Cambridge, and very much in the analytical philosophical tradition, and she rebelled against that, and she found it an unbelievably suffocating, restrictive space. And so she freed herself from that. I mean, I think she had much more of an experience of being actively contra something, and needing to kind of thrust it away and then embrace this other tradition. I think I found the incompleteness of what I had been studying, rather than I don't think I found it oppressive in the way that I think she found analytical philosophy. So, but absolutely, she had to find her own pathway, and she did it through independent reading. And I do think that when I read Leech's work and I got a sense of that biography, that's one of the reasons why I felt this very strong affinity. She wanted to put back together the things that I wanted to put back together.
And a lovely quote from her in this interview, talking about how her being unimpressed with her the people teaching her philosophy, but in the way it was taught. It teaches them to be clever, destructive, supercilious, and ignorant. It doesn't teach you what's important. But this last sentence, it doesn't feed the soul. I'm hearing that redolent for you in your own studies. You wanted something that would, feed the soul. Wow. So you found your mentor in some ways. Sorry, I'm putting words into your mouth there at this point with your DPhil and your studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Rose was that for me, and in a sense she remains that figure. Yeah. Now,
if we unpack Gillian Rose a little and your PhD work, so I know this was a pathway into Hegel and the broken middle, the title of one of Gillian's books. I did watch a little of you online. The timeline, is it from Nottingham University?
Yeah, the wonderful St John's Nottingham videos that they made, which I just think is a brilliant series. Weird,
and I enjoyed it, and we'll put that again, make a link available to that. And again, like everyone else, I think when I say I read one book by Hegel, it's a bit like your the lecture that I'm referring to of getting lost and not finding your way out.
Well, that's the general experience of Hegel, is if you get into it way beside you could never get out again.
Never get out. But again, like everyone else, I'm Hegel, he's the guy, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But hearing you just in that short lecture unpack from Gillian Rose this notion of the broken middle, that it's dwelling. I heard you say, and I'm going to ask you a question in a moment, and I probably got this wrong, but dwelling in that place of things that don't immediately reconcile and don't synthesize. And that was just so fascinating. Could you just unpack that a little bit more, what that means? Because I'm going to also come on to some other questions about some of your other work that you're doing at the minute. So what is this notion of the broken middle? What did it mean for Gillian Rose? What does it mean for you in terms of a place and a space to think and be?
So Hegel is often read, I think, wrongly and crudely, as being a sort of dialectical thinker of, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where you simply take one thing, its opposite, and then you reconcile it. Rose was offering this sort of middle tradition, this kind of Mitte tradition reading of Hegel as a speculative thinker. And she was situating Hegel alongside Kierkegaard and a series of other Jewish sources as well that allowed her to do this work. And I think for her, she saw the dance, the play of ideas and practices in this complex space. And one of the things she wanted to do, using that more negative tradition, she actually did her PhD on Adorno and negative dialectics. And I think for her, she wanted to pull thought and action back from this idea that you could rush too quickly to the synthesizing, to the solution, and to what she would call the mended middle or the holy middle. And it's an attempt partly to think the nature of violence in all of its forms and to think failure and confront it and deal with it. And I think for Rose, the language of the broken middle gave a way to think about the impossible, the absolutely broken, the inherently violent, and it was her way of pulling us back from that temptation that thought faces, and particularly theology faces, to construct holy middles that evade the absolute brokenness of the world. And I think what's really interesting, I was reading something a couple of days ago that was describing thinkers like Rose and Simone Weil and others as kind of radical pessimists, and I think that gets it wrong. So there's a danger that one thinks that the language of the broken middle is somehow a language that's entirely about, the inevitability of failure, brokenness, violence, blah, 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 and therefore it's a form of radical pessimism. I don't think it is. I think it's this absolute insistence on the kind of brutal stripping back and looking at the world as it is, and the complete difficulty of really doing that without the human spirit needing to rush quickly to evade the difficulty of thinking opposing things, of thinking things that seem incommensurate, appear to us in that way, and remaining with it in a disciplined way such that we are able to dwell in it and find a way through it without this rush to holy and mended middles. And I found the intellectual discipline of spotting that rush to holy middles and mended middles. I found that my whole life intellectually fruitful. So it's a way for me of thinking hope without rushing too quickly over the incredibly difficult process of handling the complexity of human affairs, put in its kind of simplest form. Now, she's offering a sort of much more sort of Hegelian philosophical version than I'm making it sound. I'm making it sound a bit existential somehow. But that's kind of how I've put it to use and the way I've found it, helpful in guiding my own work. And I didn't work formally on the broken middle as an idea for my thesis. I worked on the idea of the third city, which is taken from her inaugural lecture that she gave when she became a professor in Warwick. And she set out in that inaugural lectures 4 cities, a way of talking about the broken middle through the analogy of cities, which obviously if you've studied Augustine and Augustine's cities and you've thought, but so it's this resonant idea about thinking in terms of cities analogically. And the first city is old Athens, which is pure reason, the idea that you reconcile and you deal with the world through the exercise of pure reason. The second city is New Jerusalem, which is the ethics of love. So you don't need to deal necessarily with reason, you just need to deal with the immediacy of relations of human love, and it's to construct an ethics which for her can be both either a pure religious tradition or indeed postmodernism, which she thinks, so Levinas is the face, etc. So there's both philosophical, secular versions of New Jerusalem thinking that want to rush to mend all issues of complexity and justice with an ethic of love. Religious, non-religious traditions of those, that's the second city, New Jerusalem. The third city then has no name, and it's kind of the space in which all of these different views compete and collide. It's simply the present, its actuality in all of its complexity. And it is also for her the possibility, not the inevitability, but the possibility of the single just actor. So the language in Jeremiah, one man, one woman for the redemption of the city. It's the space where you can act. So it's the space for Antigone. It's the space where it's possible to do something that enacts justice in complexity. And then there's the fourth city, which is the anti-city, Auschwitz. And she took the work of somebody that she knew very well, who had looked at the development of architectural plans by the Nazis for the sort of Germanification of Upper Silesia. I'm dragging this from some part of my memory, and where Auschwitz had been not the state of exception as a camp beyond the space, but rather would have been the heart of the city. And so she thinks of Auschwitz not as this ineffable space beyond, but rather as something which was going to be the very beating heart, the rather deathly heart of an entire industrial city complex. And she thinks Auschwitz as a city of violence, destruction, etc. Therefore, the anti-city, which is always a possibility. So it's her way of thinking of it, what we might call more Schmittian terms, a state of exception, but thinking of it still in the analogical language of the city. And I was very taken with the helpfulness of that analogical structure. So my PhD work was actually on thinking about how theology could resource thinking about the third city, and a critique of pure New Jerusalem, pure old Athens, and an avoidance of the fourth city, the collapse into a state of death and violence, and that theology needed to figure all of these temptations and to tarry with those. And so my thesis, in a sense, was trying to do what I felt was the unfinished work on the beginnings of this idea of the third city.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Augustine. So in preparing for today, and again, a cursory quick look at Gillian and you, immediately I'm thinking, gosh, there's some Augustinian resonances here, ideas of the corpus mixticum, and theologically, eschatological issues, the res publica and all those kinds of things. And so my question was going to be, did she make any Augustinian correlations, or was that a big part of your work, or given your Catholic background and Catholic social teaching?
Yeah, Rose absolutely had read Augustine, and she knew what she was playing with when she was, using these motifs of the cities. And I think that was a deliberate, in part, Augustinian set of references. So, I mean, she was absolutely tarrying with Augustine. Also, she knew how significant Augustine was for Arendt as well, because obviously Arendt had written her doctoral thesis on Augustine. So there's multiple ways in which Augustine becomes part of the hinterland of Rose's work. In my own work, I suppose, I have a more obvious overt commitment to a broadly Augustinian way of thinking. And I do, for all the reasons that Augustine can be problematic, I do have a fundamental set of instincts in myself that I think are Augustinian, which are partly around his language. So the way in which he takes Cicero's idea of the res publica and turns it not into the community of perfect justice, but rather into a community who can negotiate common loves. And that this is the kind of, the humanizing possibility of how a community becomes a real community rather than simply a collection of people. This is how we come to live under law together, is that we negotiate loves, visions of the world, visions of the good. So that bit of Augustine is really important to me. The other bit that's important, I suppose, is two bits. One is I've continued to work with Augustine's sense of what it means to think of evil as privation of the good. And that's become absolutely critical for the work I've done on immigration and thinking how social policy can go badly wrong. So I've written in the last 5 or 6 years quite a bit on immigration detention facilities and what immigration detention practices do to the human beings who are incarcerated within them. And it seems to me that they are precisely structures that enact the privation of the good, that become systems of lack, and therefore in denying all the most basic goods that human beings naturally strive towards, connection with other people, freedom to be self-determining, down to the very micro details of everyday life, that they are contexts in which the deprivation of all loves and goods is fundamental to the very structure of the thing itself. I've used an Augustinian way of thinking about good and evil as the framework for that work. I also have, just in the more sort of generally political work that I do, I've taught a course in Parliament for the last couple of years, and there's a bit of a pause at the moment, but I've taught a course to MPs and peers. It's a kind of history of ideas course. It's a version of my third year undergraduate course I teach in Durham that goes from Augustine to the contemporary day readings in Christian social and political ideas. And my instinct in so much of my analysis of the political is that human beings seek basic goods. That process can become deeply distorted, but it's really important to understand the goods that are being distorted, and that a capacity to think back to what some of those goods might be and to hear them into speech, and then to negotiate those, to dialogue about those yearnings. And a lot of my thinking work around Brexit and, the appearance of two irreconcilable positions and communities, an Augustinian lens about, that we are fundamental seekers of particular goods. We can't all recognise how that comes out in the wash as necessarily, goods achieved or to be valued, but listening to understand the kind of goods that people seek in communities is a vital part of how Christians ought to practice political listening and engagement, and to work with those. And some of my instincts around the negotiation of those goods and the viewing of human beings as creatures who, in whatever disordered or distorted way, do seek goods, and the patient listening to that and tarrying with it. But those, for me, it's probably unfair to load that onto Augustine entirely, my distorted view of that. But, for me, those instincts came from a reading of Augustine.
Well, you just answered the next questions I was going to ask, which was, just tying some of this thinking and work that you've done back to your great passion to see how this works in everyday life, but what that might look like. But you just did that wonderfully. Thank you. Gosh, so much there. I'm going to, in a moment, ask you about Simone Weil. Can you help me with the pronunciation?
Who knows, because there are many different ways in which her name is pronounced, and I have no reason. I generally would just say Simone Weil, but there are those who would pronounce it differently. And of course, it's a more Germanic name, but in a French context. So, I have no idea what the correct pronunciation of Simone Weil's name is, but that's I think choose one and stick to it, like a referencing system. So that's my decision, and I'll die on that hill.
I'll stick with that, and I'll use you for my justification.
Yeah, that's right. You can see my incorrectness as cover.
But before we get to her, something a bit more. We've touched on and used this phrase, Catholic social teaching, Catholic social thought. But again, for anyone listening who might not know what that is, could you give us the thumbnail sketch of what that is and why it's important, not just within Catholicism, but for you and wider work?
Yeah. So In a formal sense, Catholic social teaching is not something that language only comes first to be used in about the 1890s. And Leo XIII, who is the Pope at that point, has a major sort of neo-Thomist moment where he wants to revive a certain kind of neo-Thomism after Aquinas as the basis for how the Catholic Church might view the world politically. Now, of course, what's significant is this is a moment when the papacy's lost its lands. It's realising that its place in an emerging Enlightenment liberal world is not the place as it would have been before. This is not a throne and altar world as it would have been before, and that there is a need to reconfigure the way in which the Catholic Church relates to the world, social and political. In fact, even the idea that there is a social world is a language that belongs to that period. It's kind of generated in that moment. So the Church begins to talk about the social question, by which it means a set of human relationships that define a common life world. And it starts to talk about industrial capitalism. It develops a sort of social theory of human relationships, the fundamental sort of social orientation of human beings in the light of the longer Catholic tradition. So on the one hand, it's fair to say that it's not language that's used formally before the 1890s, but on the other hand, it isn't really something that happens in a fully new way, but rather is the kind of revivification of a longer, older tradition of an attempt to think the world from a Catholic perspective. So it belongs to the same train of thought that Augustine belongs to, that Aquinas belongs to, that some of the Christian mystical figures belong to. So it's peculiar to imagine that there is a fundamental separation between something that popes do after 1891 and all of that Christian social history before it. But there is something intentionally new that happens with the beginning of the tradition of writing what's called social.
So you mentioned Pope Leo XIII. So is it Rerum Novarum?
So the first text is Rerum Novarum. Simply means on new things. So the title of each social encyclical is taken from the first words of the document, bizarrely. So rather than giving it, I mean, you would never do that for an article, would you? Whatever the first three words are in the article becomes the title. That'd be horrific. But anyway, that's what they do for social encyclicals. So yeah, the Latin title.
So was this, you said there was something new. So because I was going to say, was it more a codifying of something that was already there? And a highlighting of it, or was it a development of it?
I think it's a development of it. So I think it takes that longer tradition of sort of Catholic natural law thinking. So it's anthropology, it's theological anthropology, its view of human beings in the world from a theological perspective is entirely continuous with that Augustinian Thomist world. So human beings are creatures who are orientated towards the good, which means they are orientated towards God, their own survival, procreation, and an interdependent life together. So it tells a particular story about the human person. And I think that's its most significant contribution in some ways, is to insist on narrating a Catholic anthropology to an Enlightenment world. So we're not merely individuals, we're not merely self-seeking, we're not simply about negotiated self-interest. So already it's setting itself with a different storyline to the storyline of liberal Enlightenment, which is a kind of philosophy. So in its modern origins, it's taking some of the longer theological instincts and developing and narrating a different version of what it might be to be a Catholic and inhabiting an increasingly liberal world. And it is, it's finding a space aside from that that's still defined by liberalism. So it's not a space outside of liberalism. It's kind of a tarrying with liberalism, both in terms of practical, institutional, more mechanistic questions like, what does it mean to be a wage-earning worker in a factory? Rerum Novarum is about living wages. It's about industrial conditions. It's about the purpose of an economy. It's about the nature of governance. So it's asking and developing theories around that. But its fundamental consistency is almost an ideology critique. There's something wrong with the storyline. We're getting the story wrong. And it's an attempt to narrate that anthropology over time, always in relation to concrete conditions of the moment in which the letter is written, and therefore to proclaim the gospel to the world, and to proclaim Christ, crucified and risen, and all of the implications for a created order that is rooted in the goodness of creation and a destiny in a form of divine communion eventually, and that what we experience in life now is not something in fundamental tension with that, but is grace perfecting nature, as the Catholic tradition, teaches. So it's a social version of the doctrine. So when it's described as social doctrine rather than social teaching, in some ways that's perhaps a better description of it. It is a social working out of the fundamental doctrinal instincts of the Catholic imagination.
Yeah. So 1891, moving into a post-industrial society, trying to articulate from a Catholic perspective and faith the dignity of the individual and of work, but the social, I'm hearing from you, the social limits of some of the emerging nature of capitalism and industrial society within all the relationships that people are embedded. So family, home, work. Is that sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. And also a critique of democracy as well. So the kind of limits of democracy. So some of the most interesting bits to my mind are, for example, the letters of the otherwise slightly problematic Pope Pius during the Second World War, who, for sure, there were massive problems around a failure of solidarity with the Jewish community, but he writes these extraordinary Christmas messages, which are basically a deconstruction of what's wrong with when democracy goes awry. And actually, I've been rereading them in the light of Trump and populism, and so they are so resonant in those terms. They're very much, they also echo lots of Alexis de Tocqueville on the problem with tyrannies of the majority, democracies that lose their way, that end up with a kind of mob culture, that simply because a majority chooses to believe something, it can be born of a kind of sluggish mass instinct, which actually can betray dignity, solidarity, and real human goals. So there's a very interesting critique of the sort of limits of democracy and the purpose of democracy. And although the church has a massive problem with liberalism as an ideology, it has a commitment to a sort of critical and constructive engagement with democracy as a set of practices. And often the more interesting thoughts about governance get lost, because it's assumed that Catholic social teaching is basically about, family and living wage and, etc. And, did John Paul II, support capitalism or not? And, his tarry with communism. But there's a whole tradition of thinking about governance and the limits of governance and the nature of democracy. And I think Pope Francis has picked that up as well. John Paul II, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have also developed a very strong ecological dimension to thought, and I think obviously that's one of Francis's major contributions, is to tie together, to see the fundamentally integral nature of economy, governance, and ecological structures, to refuse to think those apart. And again, the contribution of Laudato Si, which is the most recent of Pope Francis's social encyclicals, is about saying the first conversion to seeing the integral connection between these things and living well with them is a sort of contemplative one, of rejecting the idea of the sovereign self, who simply has no duties and makes their way in the world by will and assertion, but rather the first acceptance is of the presence of the other. And that other, you have to have a contemplative relationship to that, whether it's me to you or me to God. But that contemplative ability to perceive the presence of the other, and to act in relation to that contemplative view of the world, the ability to contemplate something outside of the self in a fundamental way that moves the human spirit, divine and human. That's, I think, one of Francis's main contributions to the continued development of Catholic social teaching. And I think that more contemplative mystical dimension has been significantly underplayed. We often think that the biblical part's been underplayed in Catholic social teaching, and that can be true as well. There's lots of pretexting and a lack of integration there. But I actually think the bit that could be most transformative for our own age is developing that more contemplative and mystical side to social doctrine.
Right. Yeah. So Catholic social teaching, Catholic social phrase it with the word doctrine. Again, for the people we're anticipating listening to this, it's beyond the issue of encyclicals. How does that doctrine get operationalized and deployed in aspects of everyday life?
Well, I mean, one of the first things to say is that the direction of travel is not best thought of as the Pope writes the document and it gets applied to the world. The process of an encyclical being written is inspired by, very often, action on the ground. So Rerum Novarum, even in 1891, was inspired by the work of bishops in real communities in Germany and England. So the dock workers' strike in the East End of London, and the work of Cardinal Manning, and also the work of a German bishop, von Kettler. And that would be true equally of more recent documents as well. So it's not a kind of theory to practice application. It's rather a dynamic of discernment in the world, I think, of the action of the Spirit. And so that's an endlessly circular process. And, you know, I think a good encyclical is one that is about learning from the practice of the body of the church as it seeks engagement with the world. And it offers theoretical connections and frameworks for that, and offers it outwards to a global community and inspires further action. But I do think we need to see that it's Catholic social practice that generates Catholic social teaching, which in turn generates Catholic social practice. But that, you know, but having said that, you know, obviously, traditionally religious orders, men and women's religious orders, were key ways in which Catholic social teaching has been lived out as a transformative practice, whether it's monasteries developing, you know, new economic practices, whether it's, you know, women religious as educators, as the developers of hospital care, or humanitarian work. I work with religious sisters at the moment who combat human trafficking in Europe and who do extraordinary work to intercept gangs who traffic women into Europe. And, you know, also I work very closely with organisations who work in the humanitarian sector with refugees. So, you know, there is a constant Catholic social practice which is informed by and often in advance of Catholic social teaching, but it, you know, at its best there is and ought to be a symbiotic relationship between the two, because it is about the way in which the Spirit works in the world in different forms.
So your observation personally of where Catholic social doctrine could lean into, I think you said the mystical a bit more. Could you just, is that something that's happening on the ground? Is this your own desires for it? Could you tell, and what would that be? What would that look like?
I mean, in a sense, I don't think you can legislate for what it might look like, but I think...
What would you hope it would be?
So the bits that tie together, for me, what Pope Francis says in Laudato Si would say what's there in Simone Weil and others I think of as political mystics, is that the first apprehension, and actually Rowan Williams says this of Barth, you know, the difference between a merely social theory that says, here's society, this is what it means, this is how to have a decent version of living together. A social theory always begins with an assertive action on the world, whereas a Christian social vision, if it's properly contemplative, has to begin first of all with a non-action, with a receptivity, and even a displacement of the self. So it begins with a process of communication that is receptive, and that reception and a recognition of what that means involves seeing oneself in the world in a non-sovereign way. You know, and Weil says really interestingly that, you know, what is sin? Sin is that we imagine that we are centres of our own world, that we place ourselves at the centre of the world, and that we imagine that our sovereign will is the way that we act. And that to be graced and to accept the operation of grace is to allow your own life, the life of the creature, to pass into the life of the uncreated, of the divinity. And in passing your own creatureliness back into its origin, you find a way to pass more deeply into the world in a less egocentric way. And I suppose I would view almost all of the main social challenges we face in our generation, whether it's you know, the movement of humans, so whether it's migration, or whether it's ecological questions, or right now whether it's pandemic and viral questions, that all of those require us to make that journey of a recognition of what is not me, and lays claim to me, and transforms me and is dependent on me and isn't dependent on me. It's a recognition of all of those things, and therefore a healthy displacement of the self, the passing of the life of the creature into this wider created and uncreated world. And through that, I suspect we find more ethical answers to how to live in a better, broader ecology with human and non-human others. And I just think that contemplative drive, which is one of conversion, away from a myopic view of the world that we're constantly tempted into, is the grounds of social regeneration.
Well, that brings us very nicely to Simone Weil and a couple of questions I've got for you. I've been looking at an article on togetherforthecommongood.co.uk, and you draw on Simone there, and I think her book, The Need for Roots, and you draw on that in the face of Brexit. And I understood as I was reading your article the need for roots that human beings require to live in a rooted way in the world, but we are in a world with, due to things like social mobility, that we're unrooted. So could you unpack that for a little?
Yeah, I can.
For us, why what that meant, what Simone Weil meant, and why that's important for us at this point in our society, with all the things that the hinterland that you just. So we've got Brexit, and Brexit seems an ancient memory as we do this interview today, but in the face of the pandemic and everything that's coming from that.
So Bay's an interesting figure because she died very young. So she died in her 30s, and she died midway through the war as a refugee and an exile. And at the time she died, she'd been working on a work that had been commissioned, her only full monograph sort of length book. Everything else was more aphoristic writings, notebooks and essays, etc. But this was her kind of single whole book that she'd conceived, and it had been commissioned by the Free French movement in London. And she'd written it thinking that what she was doing was producing a manifesto for the transformation of Europe after the Second World War, that it was kind of a blueprint, particularly for the redesign of France after the disaster of the Vichy regime and the occupation, etc. And in the end, this book, which was called The Need for Roots, was rejected by many of those who had been involved in its commissioning. So de Gaulle famously hated it, and many others dismissed it for being too theological, too mystical in its origins. But much of the text is an analysis, as the title would suggest, of the deep human need for rootedness, for roots. Now, I mean, there's a danger of imagining that she's simply writing about people who are sort of forced into migration as refugees, etc. She's not. She's trying to say that the entire way in which late modernity lives is one of fundamental uprootedness. So the economy is uprooted. The way we live social and cultural relationships is uprooted. So we might stay in the same place our whole lives, but we're still subjected to an experience of uprootedness. And that's one of the things that drew me particularly to her work. So industrial capitalism uproots. In other words, it cuts us off from the most fundamental things that allow us to thrive as human beings. And then she lists a kind of, not quite a shopping list, but she lists and itemizes the basic need of the human soul, which is for things like order, hierarchy. And she has this pairing where it's almost a set of what could seem like contradictions, but in fact aren't. And it's a provocative list because, we don't often think that we do need hierarchy or order as really basic human needs. But she lists these needs, and then she lists the kind of obligations, the human obligations that we bear in the light of a recognition of these fundamental human needs, which are connected to the way in which we root ourselves in communities in which we are recognised, belong, are able to fundamentally participate, and which secure for us these basic goods. So I read this, I read it a long time ago, because I read it originally when I was working on Gillian Rose, because Rose uses Arendt and Weil and Rahel Varnhagen and Rosa Luxemburg and others. But I came back to it in the context of Brexit because it suddenly struck me that so much of what Weil writes about in terms of a need for rootedness struck me as part of the goods, and I realise there's a danger of articulating it like this for some people, but the goods that people wanted or imagined that Brexit would secure for them. And I felt that they offered a framework for thinking with a Brexit voting constituency where you didn't have to simply explain away people's vote by simply saying they were deluded, or they were voting on the basis of racism, or, you know, which isn't to say that some people did not vote on the basis of all sorts of complex things, but I felt that somehow it was speaking about others rather than with them. And it's never good if you find yourself describing people in a way that they simply cannot own themselves, you know, with integrity. And I felt that they offered a way of listening beyond divisions to the fundamental aspirations for a good life that people had. And I felt that there was a massive no, as well as a yes, involved in the referendum vote. To be clear, I voted Remain. I am pro-European. I also think that model has lost its way. But I felt, particularly living in the Northeast and coming from a family who, my extended family voted, you know, in very divided ways on both sides, I felt that there was a need to kind of deeply listen and understand what motivated, and that these were competing visions of the good. And that if we didn't come to terms with that, we would never reach a future beyond Brexit that had any kind of reconciled national life. And both language about rootedness and uprootedness offered a chance to articulate that. And I think people wanted strongly a return to a sense of some kind of community in which they felt invested, recognised, which had meaningful work, decent possible patterns of family life and social solidarity. And they felt that there was something about the model of national and global life that they were inhabiting that did not offer that possibility. So it came out of both an experience of hopelessness on the one hand, but also a genuine aspiration to particular sorts of goods. And that was the bit that a Remain voting constituency did not want to hear and couldn't hear. And I just think that common experience of uprootedness across communities where the cost of that is borne more by some than others, is something that has to be recognised as part of a sort of re-enfranchised national life, but also that we have to treat people in a non-patronising way as people who know things in a deep felt sense. And what was being articulated in the referendum was a certain sort of expertise by experience, a certain experience of the world and knowledge of the world and seeking after particular goods. And that wasn't recognised. And I suppose this brings us back also to the very beginning of the conversation, where I was saying I've got some nervousness around the language around social mobility, etc., and that my parents were very much the beneficiaries of a previous version of social mobility. But certainly in the area I live in here, in the Northeast, I think there's a real scepticism about that sense that you need to be, as Tony Blair's speech had it years ago, globally mobile. You need to get with the programme of globalisation, and if you don't, you'll be the left behind. What happens if the things that you instinctively feel you want as goods in your life are to live close to your family members, to live in the place that your family has lived in for generations, a particular landscape, that you have a relationship to place, to soil, to terrain, to the sound of language, and that kind of stability matters and seems increasingly denigrated and not possible. You want to live in a world where there are particular skill sets that are recognised, and that the ability to pursue a worthwhile working life within a community where you have belonged over time, and where different kinds of skills can be recognised. I think there was a huge sense that kind of life was not acceptable. Everybody needs to be like you and me, Jason. Everybody needs to have got their tale of how they left behind their roots and tried really hard and overcame adversity and made it into a university-educated professional class after all. And I think the sense of a kind of humiliation in a post-capitalist, not post-capitalist, in a post-industrial context, and a lack of interest in how you construct a meaningful, valuable life in those settings. I think all of that's simply been ignored by a political class who were uninterested, and lots of people who voted Leave, I think were voting for a constructive alternative that they imagined. Whether that's a real possibility is a different matter. But I think we need to understand the kind of uprootedness that people felt affected them, which was not really about migration or mobility in that sense, but a collective sense of a world, where the centre no longer holds.
I'm going to indulge myself in one question for my own research interests here at this point, if I may. So given our conversations we've had in the past about commodification, the pernicious nature of it, aside from any wonders of what Brexit would deliver, the nature of commodification in late capitalism that disembeds us even from, if we can be in a locality and living next door to our parents and neighbours, but we have commitments that mean we have these deep desires for authenticity and locality and community. And is that going to be possible without a return to some sort of, I say, right-wing nationalism? But does the question make sense that I'm framing? How do you move towards that particularity and locality without something from the state politically force, and again I'm going to use the word social mobility, intervening in that state of affairs for social mobility? Does that question make any sense, Hanna?
Well, sort of, if I'm understanding you rightly. So my sense is that there has to be a kind of intervention from the state that resets a more regional politics, and that makes it possible for people to speak together in public. So we need a different kind of public life that enables us to negotiate goods in common, and that it sees us as more than self-interested creatures who trade with each other, and that so much of the commodification comes from that reductive view of what it means to be human, and the kind of forbidding of those conversations about the good life as not really belonging in a public space. Hanna Arendt writes about the way in which public life comes into being in the interest, the space between two people, and it's the act of recognition, negotiation that brings a public life into focus. And I think our public life has become very, very thin in that sense. So some capacity to have an intervention from the state that resets a non-London centric, regionally focused, locally generative set of policies, that helps. But I think there's a whole other question about the negotiating of a life together, of genuine cares, loves, interests, and a capacity for those to speak again publicly. And it requires animating contexts for that to happen. The church clearly ought to be one feature of that landscape that enables those conversations to happen, but it cannot be the sole agent of that, in a multicultural, post-secular space. So a capacity to have some of those conversations, that gives me some sense that there is an agenda to be negotiated beyond the current impasse, and it requires both state and non-state actors to generate that alternative politics. And much of that will also come through disruptive movements as well. And we've seen globally the rise of a series of movements which may look on the surface of it some quite disruptive, but I think it will require a multiplicity of forms to generate, some of which will look like rupture and interruption, and some which will look more kind of institutional in form. But I think it will require a multiplicity of those to interrupt and generate.
I mean, don't people in general, they want schools that have got great PTAs, they want, local councillors that are embedded and grew up in the community, and MPs that were known there, and we want all of these kinds of things that seem to be hankering after them and desperate for them. But even at a popular level, people like Naomi Klein highlights, but we just won't make the commitments that are required for those ways of life. So yeah, there's some of my suspicion towards, Brexit as a vote towards that. But are we willing to live and make the changes that are necessary for that kind of common good, isn't it? It's a common good.
No, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I think the Augustinian language is quite helpful, that you do need to discern the kinds of goods that people are articulating at the base of these things, but that doesn't give you the solution, that doesn't give you the way forward. And we should expect that, bearing in mind the structures we live with, there would be an active resistance to the very ways of achieving the goods that people might actually want. And that's the kind of broken middle that we live with. You know, is a yearning for community, but you imagine the way to achieve that is to close the borders. That you yearn for, you know, a post-industrial economy that gives you meaningful work. But actually, what does it mean to generate that kind of work, and who will be the actors who create an entirely new way of working together? So again, we're back to that space that seems impossible but cannot be so. And what's the patient politics that works away, and the patient ecclesial life that opens the space of imagination, that doesn't rush to mend the middle? And I think the danger for me is that Brexit is the rushed, false holy middle. I don't think it is the answer, speaking personally, but I respect that there are people who hold a different opinion, and it is a matter of conjecture and opinion. But I think that we have to live with and work at the interface of that gap between the goods that were articulated, the reality that I think we do live in a fundamentally uprooted context, and the way in which that then makes it incredibly difficult to get hold of the solutions that we need to collectively, and we can be our own worst enemies in that process. So then what do we do with that?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I've been working hard in the interview. We're on the home straight, Anna. Just pressing to Simone Weil a little bit more. She writes insightfully about Christianity and affliction. Not that I've read much of Simone. I've enjoyed the bits that I have, and again, in preparing for today, I got Stephen Plant's.
Oh yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, great. I mean, you've pointed out, you didn't use the word here in the interview, saccharine, but in other places you pointed out, and maybe it was in the interview online, that she didn't have a saccharine view of human existence, and we needed to give attention to the places where we suffer. And I was comparing that with a sort of, you know, the modern tropes for most of us of wanting to avoid suffering and affliction at all costs. And I think somewhere you talked about how she wasn't. You used the word pessimistic, didn't you? That she wasn't. What was the phrase that you use? Not realistic pessimism, but anyway, why is that perspective helpful, as you've highlighted in it, and the need to give attention to suffering and affliction? And I guess I've got in mind we're in the middle of a pandemic at the minute. That could be helpful at the moment, couldn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the things that just to make a connection to begin this with what I was saying earlier, one of the things that marks out this canon of women thinkers who I think belong together is precisely this non-sentimental, unsentimental view of suffering. So all of them, whether it's either Stein, Gillian Rose, Arendt, they all insist on this absolute rejection of the saccharine, and they want this non-sentimental, confronting relationship to suffering and to evil, and Weil is no exception within that, and is a particularly notable example of this trend. One of the things that Weil has to say, which I think is particularly helpful, is precisely what you said a moment ago, which is that we do not find thinking about suffering easy. And she doesn't mean that in a glib way, oh gosh, it's a difficult thing to do. She thinks our minds actively recoil from it. And she thinks that there's a theological reason why our minds actively recoil from suffering, which is about the very nature of what suffering is itself. So she thinks that the thing that is most divine, most sacred about the human being is that we fundamentally hold on to the belief in the good, that it is possible that there is good in the world and that good should be done to us and not harm. So when we're confronted with the reality of suffering in its most existential form, when it happens to us, it tears at the heart of the human spirit, because it tears at that most sacred core, which is our fundamental draw to be in relation to the good. So as we experience harm, we think, you know, good God, well, literally, you know, good God, you know, the universe is disordered. This disrupts this relation. So for her, every time we experience suffering ourselves, it tears at us in this fundamental way, sort of complex suffering, not when I stub my toe or when I get normal flu. But if I experience something really traumatic that is afflicting in some way, and affliction is like the limit case of suffering, the sort of extreme end of the spectrum, then it tears at this kind of sacred core of ourselves. The same happens when we look out at the world and we see, the death of George Floyd, or we see, pandemic suffering, or we see the Holocaust, whatever it may be. Our spirit recoils from wanting to really confront what that is, because it confronts us with this thing that tears at the sacred heart of the human being. And I found that sense that our mind struggles to stay with suffering true. And it makes thinking suffering particularly hard, because we will do anything apart from really think about what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. Our minds want to immediately be consoled, to turn to something easier, etc. And therefore we don't always think suffering well. And if we have that as a sort of existential starting point, I think it makes us get to grips with the challenge in front of us all the more readily. And so I just find even that insight, helpful, that our minds draw away from it. And certainly I found that, helpful in writing on some of the stuff I've written on in terms of the experience of refugees, etc. So I'm drawn to her from that perspective. I think the other thing is that she sees suffering as something which is fundamentally mysterious. So she's an unusual and uncomfortable thinker for the following reason. She does not give us an answer as to why there is suffering in the world. She doesn't think it is possible to do so. She does not want to make it saccharine by saying it is simply sent by God and intended, and therefore, there's a tendency in some Christian thought to either aestheticize suffering. So in some way it's about beauty, so we can turn it into some theory around beauty, or we can put it to work ethically by suggesting it simply improves us morally, or it's some kind of ultimate testing ground, or whatever it may be. And she refuses to legitimate suffering in the sense of saying that it is given to us for this purpose and can be explained in terms of goodness in some way. She refuses that explanation. But uncomfortably, what she says to us is we must love our suffering because it is simply what is. So we become ourselves in relation to it. So it's not because we can aestheticize it, we can moralize it, but rather it is simply factual. And it becomes part of our life histories, part of our stories, and therefore cannot be separated from the path that leads us to the divine, to God, to a reconciled way of being in the world and ultimately beyond the world. And again, there are all sorts of people who would be deeply troubled by me saying this, and I'm very happy to be challenged by them, but I do find that helpful. That I cannot explain the suffering I have seen or known in others, or even in my own life. Limited as that suffering is, I cannot always explain it, but it is factual, it is what is, and therefore it is still capable, it is still possible for me to imagine that I may love it in some sense. I can say it's horrific in all sorts of ways, but it becomes part of who I am, and it is a space that is not beyond the generative. Because it's not beyond the regenerative capacities of a God who suffuses all things, including the experiences of limit, failure and suffering. So I find that attractive but troubling. And there is, the most troubling side of her work on suffering, and stop me if this is too much, but the most troubling side of her work on suffering is really that there are times when she can seem utterly passive, face that she almost wishes her non-existence in relation to, so she wishes her existence away almost. And as one of my colleagues, Lindsay Stonebridge, puts it, Bay sits in this refugee camp writing on the life of the creature passing into the life of the uncreated, the disappearing self almost. And she's sitting in a refugee camp writing this, displaced by the Nazis. And Lindsay says, so why don't we just say she's there just saving the Nazis the job? Where's the line where almost wishing for our own disappearance through this ethical system, the sort of displacement of the self by suffering and by love of God and love of other, ends up with a disappearing self? And I think you have to watch out with Bay that there is this sort of at least problematic side of her thought that one has to tarry with, and it is the problem with the disappearing self. How do you do what she describes as decreation? She contrasts destruction, just the annihilation of the human person, which is always bad and wrong, with decreation, which is the choice to pass mystically into a relationship with the other and into the life of the divine. And it's a very fine line in terms of a sort of disappearing, annihilated self that should trouble us deeply from a Christian point of view. And it's not always clear what side of that line they sits on. So that has to be said, and it has to be tarried with in any attempt to think about her view of suffering.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So we've unpacked that a little. So if we sort of lens that back into your life and everyday life, in preparation for today, and I'd say the little bit of Simone Weil I'd read before, I had picked up that, you know, her, I'm sure it was her, the lack of love in public life, political life, and that Augustinian notion, you know, that love, you never hear politicians talking about love in debates in the House of Commons. And it got me thinking about suffering, and I'll get to my question, where how suffering is not part of normal political life in our Western democratic society, in that if a politician is suffering something, they normally withdraw. They withdraw from public life to deal with their suffering with their families. And this may not be a good illustrative example, but I was really impacted, and I want to ask you what you made of it, when Boris Johnson told his narrative of his story in hospital. I nearly said in prison. That will get me in trouble, wouldn't it? I mean, in hospital, you know, painting a story at death's door, a nurse next to his bed, you know, keeping him alive, monitoring every breath, you know. And I thought, is this a moment of a human being talking about his gratefulness in the midst of suffering, in, you know, where he's the prime minister, but he's not the prime minister. I mean, it was a either a very vulnerable display of suffering in the face of what we're going through nationally, or was it, you know, the cynic in me kicks in and goes, no, it was a carefully crafted narrative to instrumentalize suffering, to highlight the NHS and other things. That was one of the few moments I can recall recently of, you know, which would have been for him genuine suffering by the sound of it. I think some of us were worried he was going to die. Does that make any sense? What do you make of that? And do you see how suffering is part of our necessary narrative and affliction in political life?
It's an incredibly interesting thought, isn't it? And I think you're right. I haven't thought about it in quite those terms before, but I'm very struck by you suggesting that suffering is constantly displaced from public life, and that you see that particularly when politicians appear to be suffering themselves, and what you do is you withdraw because it has no place in the public. And it's a very interesting thought, isn't it, that neither love nor suffering has a place in public life. So now you cannot and should not speak the language of love, but you also should not speak the language of suffering. And maybe it should make sense to us that you would have to displace both of them, not just one of them. So if you were going to displace love, you would also have to displace suffering. If you were going to displace suffering, you would also have to displace love, because actually they're very close together. You have to be able to think both in relation. And actually that's one of the things that Weil is very clear about, is that, you know, both of those things, there's a kind of co-belonging between them.
Love allows us to bear suffering, doesn't it? I mean, it's never mind biologically, but, you know, theologically, it's, you know, it's for love that we face suffering. And so hearing you say that out loud is kind of shocking, that these two fundamentals are excluded from. Sorry, carry on.
No. And so I'm just thinking along the lines of your sort of provocation, really. And much of affliction, as Weil would describe it, is precisely this sense of a distancing from love, of a distancing from self, and a distancing from love. That's what profound suffering is. It's that experience of human isolation, of the distancing of those things. And I do think that both love and suffering are indigestible to our public lives, because they challenge us to think about vulnerability, codependent, as in a proper sense of interdependence. And they are precisely the things that trouble us most. They're also the things that are wordless. You know, both love and suffering are you know, they lead us into a space of the wordless, of contemplation. And that's something that troubles us as well, that we don't handle well in those spaces that are about assertion. But they do belong in the life of negotiation. And if politics is the practice of negotiation amongst a community, in terms of the distribution of goods, the decision on common values, the legislation of common laws, etc., then, you know, there has to be some capacity to speak the truth of love and suffering. And in the current context, and Boris Johnson's experience aside a bit, you know, one of the things we are faced with COVID-19 is that if you cannot speak of love or suffering, then you have no language to describe what's happening to us. And I think one of the moments in which I saw that politically, to make it very concrete, was I was absolutely bewildered by the failure of politicians in briefings when they were sort of trying to condition the public around expectations about lockdown, its easing, what would happen next. You know, to be sort of indicating when we might next be able to go to John Lewis, but not when we could, you know, hug a grandchild, visit a parent, meet with a distanced lover, whatever it may be. It was the inhumanity of that language, the sort of mechanistic, technocratic world that those making those announcements seemed to inhabit. And it seemed, I mean, it was just incredible to me that they were so out of tune with what people were experiencing, pared back down to the essentials, because most people had realised they really didn't need to go to John Lewis anymore, you know, or you know, wherever. And I do think that precisely in that moment, you saw that there was not a public language which could address either love or suffering as a dimension of a political common life. And it made people look cold and frankly idiotic.
Yeah. Well, if things continue as they might be, politicians may have to find that language reflexivity. I'll mention Dominic Cummings, not to talk about eyesight tests, but I'm owning this as personally. I remember watching all of that taking place on TV. And you know what I was longing for? I found myself listening to Boris Johnson TV. I was like, I wanted him to just look into the camera and go, do you know what? This is so difficult. I really need his help as a human being, and go, okay, instead of all the shenanigans that take place in politics. And again, that may have been an aspect of love and suffering. This is difficult. I need this person's support. But yeah, the way that's excluded, the most fundamental thing that we all wrestle with, that's absent from political life.
And I think one of the reasons people felt the Cummings thing so viscerally was not just, it seemed, the superficial explanation, which is right, of course, would be he took advantage of something that other people were denied the opportunity for, and so he invoked special privilege and imagined that his own rules didn't apply to him, and people cannot bear that kind of hypocrisy for good reason. But I think a deeper reading of it that really is tied to what we were just talking about is that there was an untruthfulness to it. To the explanation. So rather than saying, do you know what, I got ill, I was quite worried, I wasn't really coping with my childcare responsibilities, and I just needed to be with my family, like everybody else has felt that need to be with their family, unless they, you know, actually would find it more helpful to be distanced from them, which, you know, of course some people do. And, you know, Johnson's inability to say, this guy is absolutely key to me, I don't do this alone, and I, you know, he is integral to what I'm building, to my vision, to my politics, to my commitment, but none of those truths could be spoken. And so what happened was you get an untruthfulness at both a superficial and a deep level about what was going on. And people know that, and they sense it. And that, you know, the fact that we live in an age of profoundly untruthful leadership, of untruthful politics in these multiple ways, I think is what is impoverishing us, you know, in ways that matter really deeply.
And what do you think it would ultimately take for that truthfulness to be spoken out loud? What would it take for that transformation in our public life?
I mean, you know, the truthful answer is partly I'm not entirely sure. But I suppose a capacity for leaders who are willing to name their own interdependence and their own vulnerability, not in a sort of, you know, sentimental kind of a way, but to be honest with the public about what leadership requires and to challenge people. So a leadership that's willing to lead by example, to challenge our capacity to find a deeper humanity and a deeper set of connections, and is willing to be honest about the interconnectedness of the challenges that we face, and to provide non-mechanistic answers, non-technocratic answers, even where that will hurt. So a kind of self-sacrificial leadership that does not necessarily imagine it will win in the short term by, enacting and embodying something, but a properly embodied politics in all of the, the acting and the speaking need to belong together. Language needs to adhere to a practice that signifies something, that communicates, and an ability to really speak deeply from what our human condition looks like now, with an acceptance of the limits and the finitude that we find ourselves bumping up against, and can offer some kind of animating vision of what is practically possible by way of, a reconstituted life together right now. But I don't really see that kind of leadership on display. So it has to be generated, and it may need to be generated from outside the system before it becomes the system.
And that would there be so this sounds like the broken middle that we're talking about here, don't we? The opportunity for that place and that space. I was talking to a friend who's a pilot for an airline I won't name, who are having a very difficult time, and he says, and you're helping me understand what he was trying to articulate, what it's like to be on the receiving end of sort of organizational, institutional, the communication is cost savings, shareholders, a commitment before to the well-being of staff seems to have gone out the window, and they're just trying to quickly resolve it. And I said, what would you like? He said, I wish they would just say, do you know what, this is really difficult for all of us. Can we find a way together? Can we find a way together to solve this?
Yeah.
And he goes, why can't they do that? Why is that impossible to do?
I mean, the acceptance that good organisations and institutions are built on the basis of collaboration, of a diversity of offerings, and that the only way we get out of a tight hole is together, genuinely together, not that we're all in it together, but the capacity to construct solutions that really are collaborative and draw on the kind of giftedness that there is in the world. Organisations that will do well in the next decade, 2 decades, are surely those who will embrace that kind of diversity of thinking and that kind of creative, collaborative spirit.
Yeah. I mean, endless opportunities to collaborate together around shared affliction at the moment and coming up. We can but hope.
And skills, because I think so much of the institutional stuff, that comes out of debates about inequality, debates about race, is our refusal to actually tap into the giftedness of a whole community. And we have not, as a human community, worked out yet how we draw on that level of giftedness in a human community. We constantly block it.
Yeah, we do. So I've got 3 last things here for you, Hanna. So just take a little step further into affliction, and for you personally, and I think I'm right that you had some friends, Amanda, and was it Emile? Friends from Cambridge, who both died tragically and young and independently. You've mentioned that in other places. Is it appropriate for you to talk about that affliction for you and how it's impacted you?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an affliction for me, I suppose. I had 2 friends who were both PhD students when I was an undergraduate. I mentioned Amanda before, and both Emile and Amanda shared kind of core intellectual interests with me. Emile was a French Catholic political philosopher. He worked on Alistair MacIntyre, wrote an absolutely brilliant intellectual biography of Alistair MacIntyre, and his wife, Amanda, as she eventually became, was a jurisprudence scholar who worked on John Finnis and natural law theory. Both held posts in Cambridge, and we had our children at the same time, and so they had sort of grown up together. And very tragically and very suddenly, Emile died when he was 37. He had an aortic aneurysm, so perfectly healthy, and went from being perfectly healthy to having died within a day. And it was a complex medical negligence case as well, so it sort of added to the sort of tragic dimensions of that he could and should have been saved and wasn't. And then about 6 months after he died, his wife Amanda was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer, which was considered not to be curable, and so she was offered palliative treatment. In fact, she was so determined to be cured that she sought treatment in France herself. They were living in the UK, but she sought French treatment to sort of add to the British treatment in the hope that she would live. And she did live another 18 months, but then she died. I suppose, that was one of those wordless experiences of something that simply could not be made sense of. And, Amanda was incredibly brave about her dying and, felt that God could only wish that she would live. There could be no intention by a good God that, she should orphan her children. But on the other hand, she had a kind of radical acceptance that if this was what would happen, then she would accept it she would fight it, but kind of accept it with grace at the same time. And I think many of us who were marked by the death, and there were many of us who were marked by their deaths, as you can imagine, a community of friends and family, their deaths remain inexplicable to us, incomprehensible, and I think they will always be so. And there is no great good that has come out of it. There's no way to reconcile oneself to what happened to the children, or the extreme loss of 2 brilliant young lives. That remains a kind of a confronting legacy for me in thinking any of the material on suffering that I think with, and for me that the core of that remains mysterious, not as in I don't need to think about it, but it is without explanation.
And so I might be overlaying this in the wrong way, but is this another aspect of the broken middle?
I suspect I haven't thought about it in those terms, other than that there is no saccharine explanation on offer. There is no holy middle that mends the loss of, 14 children of both their parents, one suddenly and then one slowly, and everything that involved. So there is no holy middle that I can offer, to the children. There is only the love that remains, which can be continually poured out. There is only what remains of an operating, reconciling grace that pours out in the face of any suffering and loss. But there is an injustice in that still for me somehow, that again Simone Weil writes about. She writes about this in the context of thinking more about politics, but I suppose I have kind of applied it to personal loss. There are things that stand as a proxy where justice cannot yet be rendered because of violence, force or loss. There is an injustice there that begs to be addressed. But until that injustice can be addressed, there is love and there is hospitality. And they stand not as the overcoming and the displacement of justice, but rather as its proxy, until the point where where justice becomes apparent. And I suppose I believe profoundly in love and hospitality as precisely the proxy for a justice that is still yet to be, rendered in some sense.
Rendered, yeah. I was about to say, sounds like, rendered, like the love is big enough to hold all of that until that is rendered.
But it's not reconciled. So that's the, again, that's the kind of broken middle sense that you have to hold on to what seems a justice yet to be rendered. It's not become by, love or hospitality.
Well, thank you for letting me ask that and for sharing a little on that. Last question on Gillian Rose and Simone Weil. They were both extremely self-aware academics, and I think it would be an understatement to say that they had a complex relationship with their Anglicanism and Catholicism. Dare I ask, what is your relationship with your Catholicism? Sorry, I was going to say, is it similarly complex?
It's not complex in the way that I think. I mean, I think the complexity is more Rose and Weil's relationship to their Judaism. I think it's more complex thing in some ways, and that's perhaps where there's more parallel than in their relationship to Christianity. And they both did have complex relationships to Christianity in different ways. And of course, Gillian Rose was received into she was baptized just before she died in hospital, and Weil was not received into the church. She refused that partly as a position of solidarity with those who were excluded by the church, because she also had a deep suspicion of communities. So she's a kind of anti-community thinker. She thinks there's all sorts of dangers in being drawn into community, because communities commit violence in their own name, and in a way that they refuse to think or come to terms with, and that's a constant temptation. And I share some of those instincts. That community is something that's absolutely necessary and fundamental for me, but there are things that we do in the name of building those communities that exclude and do violence both to those who are members of it and those who stand outside the borders, as it were. And the most obviously conflicted relationship that I would have to my Catholicism is thrown up by the sexual abuse crisis, and the kind of institutional complicity in that, as well as an ongoing problem that I think obviously the church has with the leadership of women, and a recognition of a community that involves the talents and the governance quality. So I'm not thinking specifically about priesthood in a narrow sense. I'm actually thinking much more about how you constitute, lead, govern, discern within a community, and the kind of blocking of those wider gifts of discernment and full participation and collaboration that continue to worry me. So I think the dimensions of gender and the sexual abuse crisis remain for me the most conflicted relationships that I have to my Catholicism, if I'm being completely honest about it. I don't have a fundamental struggle with doctrine, and the liturgy remains central to me, and the traditions of prayer and contemplation, and I don't believe that I can achieve a Christian life by myself in a sort of solipsistic way. I don't believe it's about simply a sort of pure perfection of conscience enacted in the world. I believe in the fragile, broken, failed attempt to build community together, and so therefore I have to remain invested in the church, because there is no space for me other than that. But I do struggle with the violence of the church, and that violence is present in its thought form, in its structure, and obviously in the inherent violence of the church.
And so is that something that, again, if I use a word that we used in the last question, you don't feel the need to reconcile the gender and the institutional issues, especially, the contradiction between child abuse and Catholic social doctrine? You live with those unreconciled, is that?
Well, they are unreconciled. So as a point of fact, there is a lack of reconciliation between what the church teaches on social issues and the way in which it conducts itself institutionally. And the most clear manifestation of that is in the abuse crisis. How does a church that teaches human dignity, participation, solidarity, the common good, and the kind of anthropology that undergirds that, become massively institutionally complicit in the abuse of children? That there is de facto no reconciliation, no working through.
I wondered. That was what I wanted to suggest, but
present for. Yeah. So I remain myself. There is no reconciliation for me in that, but I don't live with it in a sort of pacified sense, as well, there just isn't a way to reconcile these things, but I need to sort of hold on to both. I live with the dynamic tension of the factual lack of reconciliation between those realities, and it outrages me, and I am part of that.
So let's finish with asking you about the North. You don't sound very northern, even though all my family are from second generation. Well, I'm the first one born in the south, and my wife as well. Everyone comes from Gateshead and Tyneside, and immediately before that from Ireland. And again, I'm one of those people that thinks anything north of Newport Pagnell, see the sign for the north. So you're in the north, proudly from the north, by the sounds of it. And we've had interesting political times, don't we? The red wall of the industrial north breached for the first time by the Conservatives. And I know you wrote about it in the article of we've looked at together for the common good. You've got some, you call them theses on there, don't you? That's the one where you talk about Simone Weil and roots, but this is in response to Brexit, and you've unpacked that a little for us. So I can guess why you wrote that. But what I wanted to know is a little more, it's probably an impossible question, especially at the end of an interview. What do you think's going on in the north at the minute, as only someone from the south could ask? What's the opportunity at the minute? I'm a southerner, I'm in London, I'm like, what do you mean Parliament might move to Manchester or Leeds? How ridiculous. But what are the opportunities in the pandemic for for the north? Why is it important? Why is the north important to you, I guess I'm asking?
Yeah, so I mean, several things. One is that, so to start with the negative, as it were, I think people, there is no such thing as just the north. And having grown up in the northwest and living in the northeast, they are culturally very, very different. So I think the north is slightly a southern construction, and yet there is something identifiably different about being from Leeds, Manchester, Newcastle, Sunderland, Carlisle, compared to being from, Hertfordshire or something, or so that there is a real difference. But I don't think in some ways that simply the north is a helpful construction, as if everybody thinks in the same way. We don't, and there are strong regional differences. And the north is also divided between more rural and urban settings. So your social attitudes, if you're from Manchester, may be very different from your social attitudes if you're living in Northumberland or wherever. I did that.
Sorry, interject. I realised there's something about there's the north and then there's the north. I met someone once who told me that Leeds wasn't really the north; it was the beginning of the south.
Yeah. Well, there's this whole question. There are many books written on this question about where the north starts. Somebody says it starts at Crewe Station. Anyway, whatever. But we have to, I think, the more serious point is that actually there are real differences within the north, and Manchester does not have the same feel as Sunderland. It really doesn't, and its social heartbeat is not necessarily the same either, and we need to have capacity to deal with those differences. But where there is a common tie, I think, is in a sense of distance from power. I think that sense that the regions are, and you could get that in Cornwall as much as you might get it in Sunderland, but there is a real sense of a distance from metropolitan power, and particularly from London. And that sense of distance from power, it's not simply powerlessness, but it is a sense of distance, profound distance from power, from where decisions are made, the ability to shape them in your favour, the sense that you're a stakeholder in those in a meaningful sense. And I do think that has to be overcome. So that, I think, drove a lot of the Brexit vote in the north, etc. as well. In terms of opportunity, so thinking more positively and thinking about what the pandemic does, I think it's been fascinating to see people's move towards home working, to realising that actually they don't necessarily have to be in a metropolitan centre, that there is a possibility for a regeneration of the regions. And I know that this is an active thought, I think, for many in particularly northern cities, is how a sort of post-pandemic future might be a more regional one. I think the attraction of simply London and the southeast will be reduced a little by current events, and I think that the longer the pandemic goes on for, the more that may well affect people's fundamental sense of political psychology, in favour of a more regional set of opportunities. There's massive creativity and potential in the regions full stop, including in the north. And that has to be tapped. And I think the pandemic is potentially, but not inevitably, a game changer in that regard.
Thank you. So my last question, see if I can frame this. So Catholicism, broadly, I guess we can consider it an an outsider status in England, and some of the ways that you've articulated yourself. Again, I use the phrase, you ploughed your own furrow, had your own interest, did your own reading, found your own mentors through literature. I suppose that's the question I'm asking: has Catholicism made you? Is it inevitable where you've ended up? How much was part of the outsider nature of your Catholicism drove you into the reading and the person you've become as an academic and your interests?
Yeah, I mean,
is that question, Hanna?
Yeah. So I suppose an honest answer to sort of everything.
That's probably very, very simplistic of me.
No. It's not, I mean, I think it's fine. I think everything I have done has probably been simply an outworking of the questions that inhere in that Catholicism. So the PhD, the kind of political activism I've been involved in, all of those things are an outworking of that identity, in a sense. They're simply a sort of journey of the discovery of who I think I am in the light of a tradition I was gifted membership of. And so it's less a sense of a sort of formal vocation and more a living out of what it means to wrestle with having been placed, having been born into, having been baptized into this community with its ideas. So everything I've done is a tarrying with that, a finding of the limits of it, a finding of the possibility of it, a necessity in exploring its contours and its outworkings. So in one sense, if what lies behind the question is some of that, this is an outworking of that, I'm sure. I mean, I don't think about it in those terms. Your question has provoked me to perhaps own that. So which means it's a good question. I'm not sure about the outsider thing. I suppose actually you could say that I had such a kind of sense of belonging to a particular community that it set me with a sense of rootedness, actually, to go back to that it provided me for life with a sense of a community of belonging. So it's less about what I don't belong to and what I have a sense that I do belong to and is my heritage. And like the membership of any community, you can have massive problems with the community you belong to, and yet a fundamental sense that it's yours by right or by gift as well. And so I tarry with that. I struggle with what it means to belong to that specific community. I think it does give you a confidence because you are, as a Catholic, you are kind of an outsider in a sense. I mean, I wouldn't overplay that, and I wouldn't overplay a sort of persecution narrative. Hasn't been very much my experience. I have experienced anti-Catholicism throughout my whole life, obviously, but not in a way that's actually ever really limited me, although I do know others who have been. So I don't feel hugely like an outsider, but it gives me a stability of viewpoint that sometimes means it's okay to stand outside of things. It gives me a critical vantage point, and it reduces the sense of insecurity in challenging what appear to be accepted norms or common sense or common rules. So sometimes that experience of belonging and non-belonging, as it interacts in a complex way, provides you with a very fertile space. And again, I suppose that's what I sensed in Gillian Rose, Simone Weil, Hanna Arendt, was both their belonging and their non-belonging, that they're women who constantly transgress the borders, are thrown out of the community they seem to belong to, seek to inhabit the tradition they were given, but struggle with it, carry with it, push to its limit, and become at times quite uncomfortable members of those communities of belonging. And my own version of that, I suppose, is is something that has defined and continues to define my work, that belonging and non-belonging.
I'm going to sneak an extra question in here, maybe even more cheeky. I know you lived in London, and so you can contrast well the difference between metropolitan London and the regions, like where you are, and you're back up in Durham. But the situation you find yourself in at the minute, with that richness, I just love the way you've described that. you made it sound like family. Oh God, there were some problems with my family, but I do love them. There's a rich place for you to work from, to stretch into. But way back in this interview, uncovering that you were it sounded like an accidental academic. That's my description
Absolutely.
of it. You weren't.
No, I've used that phrase myself. Yeah.
Yeah, you weren't looking for that. Is that still a mode for you? You used the word tarry a moment ago. Are you still tarrying in the place that you're in, pulling on threads, reading around, finding things? And, are you sort of like, do you know what's happening for the next 20, 30 years? Or you're like, I have no idea where I may end up in the next 20, 30 years?
It's exactly that. I'm here for as long as wrestling with those questions with others feels to me like a fruitful space to be, and is, where I feel is a space that feels generative, and which can be a hospitable space to be with others in as well. And I think there is massive value in an academic life. And I think probably the earlier version of me would have been suspicious that there was, that the real action was all somewhere else. And I think I've kind of grown up a bit and accept that, that there is a huge value in the work that my colleagues do as academics. And, I do accept more that I have a belonging. I have a citizenship in this world as well now. But for me, I have always inhabited it with a sense that it's in service to, in dialogue with, in partnership with non-academic entities. And it's the capacity, therefore, to sort of, I know it's a sort of horribly overused academic word now, but kind of co-produce knowledge at the interface of different kinds of practices and different ways of knowing, of which academic knowing is only one. So no, I didn't intend to be here. I haven't fought it, but I'm an entirely accidental academic, and I have no idea where I would be in 10 years or 20 years. It may be doing exactly this still. It may not be, but I'm quite at peace with that, sense of unknowing about that, really, both a sort of mysteriousness as to how I ended up here in the first place, and an openness about what that path, should there be one, looks like.
Great. Well, thank you, Anna. That's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for letting me quiz you at the depth that I did, and thank you for letting us excavate your background and all the things that made you, many of the things that made you you and got you to where you are today, and wish you well in the future, and thank you for everything that you've done and everything that you're doing.
No, not at all. Thanks so much for having me. It's been helpful questioning.
We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences, and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.